In the year 1243, in a monastery nestled among rolling hills in the heart of England, there lived a scribe named Thomas. Thomas was 51 years old, with ink-stained fingers and silver-streaked dark hair. On this particular autumn morning, as golden light filtered through the high windows of the scriptorium, Thomas was preparing to do something he had done countless times before, yet today felt somehow new. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a quiet monastery scriptorium where we will follow Thomas through the gentle art of illuminating ancient texts. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Thomas arranged his workspace with the unhurried care of someone who had performed this ritual for decades. The scriptorium was cool and hushed, filled with the soft whisper of parchment and the faint scent of oak gall ink, earthy and familiar like the monastery itself. Before him lay the day's work, a gospel passage waiting to be colored, the preliminary black letters already laid down by a younger scribe's steady hand. Thomas's role was different. He brought the words to life. His fingers, marked by years of careful work, reached first for the small vials of ground pigment. Lapis lazuli, precious blue stone ground to powder, worth its weight in silver. He held the vial up to the morning light, and the powder seemed to glow with an inner warmth. Beside it sat madder lake for reds, verdigris for greens, and gold leaf so delicate it trembled at the slightest breath. These were his companions, these colors. They had been with him longer than most of the monks currently walking the cloister. The bell for prime had rung an hour ago. Thomas had eaten his breakfast of dark bread and weak ale in companionable silence with the other scribes, and now the morning stretched before him, uninterrupted hours until the bell for sext would call them to midday prayer. The stone walls around him seemed to hold the quiet like water holds light. Dust motes drifted through the high windows, catching the sun's slow movement across the room. He began, as he always began, with the small things. A brushstroke of gold leaf, laid down with a mixture of gum arabic and egg white, so thin that his brush seemed to paint with light itself. His hand moved with the certainty of long practice, yet never rushed. This was how he had learned more than 40 years ago, when his master had taught him to think of painting not as a race, but as a meditation, each stroke an offering, each color a prayer made visible. The blue came next. Thomas mixed the precious lapis lazuli with a binder, creating a paste the color of a summer sky. As he worked the pigment with a small stone pestle, he hummed plain chant melodies, the same ones the monks sang at every office. His voice was quiet, almost to himself, a habit so old he no longer noticed he was doing it. The repetitive sound seemed to settle into the work itself, making his hands steadier, his concentration deeper. By mid-morning, the letter had begun to transform. What had been black lines on pale parchment now held dimension, depth, and something almost alive. The blues swam across the page like water, the reds glowed like embers, and where Thomas had begun to apply the gold leaf in fine lines, the letter seemed to catch actual sunlight and hold it captive within its curves. He paused to observe his work, setting down his brush carefully. This moment of observation was sacred to him, the moment when he could truly see what he had created, separate from the act of creating it. His contentment was quiet and complete, not excitement. Thomas had learned long ago that excitement led to mistakes. Rather, it was a deep satisfaction, the kind that came from doing work one understood in one's bones. The warmth of the scriptorium wrapped around him like a familiar cloak. The smell of the parchment, the weight of the brush in his fingers, the slight pressure needed to lay down the pigment without smudging. All of this was home to him in a way that went deeper than simple familiarity. The afternoon light began its slow shift toward gold. Thomas continued his work, but more slowly now, with even greater care. In the late hours before sext, the light would become too warm, too amber, and colors would shift in ways that could deceive the eye. He had learned this trick decades ago when an impatient younger version of himself had completed an entire page of Illumination, only to discover in the morning light that he had mixed his greens poorly. Around him, the other scribes worked in their own quiet rhythms. Brother Edmund, 3 tables away, was copying a passage from the Book of Job, his pen scratching softly against parchment in a rhythm like rainfall. Near the window, Brother Cuthbert was binding pages into signatures, folding them, pressing them with his ink-stained hands, preparing them for the binder's needle. No one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full of presence, of work, of the kind of companionable quiet that only comes from years of working alongside others with shared purpose. Thomas's eyes, still sharp despite his years, traced the curve of the letter he was completing. There, in the tail of the queue, he would place a small detail, a flourish that only someone looking closely would notice. A tiny creature, barely larger than a grain of wheat, peeking out from the letter's curve. Such small surprises were his secret joy. No rule of the monastery forbade them. They were simply there, hidden in the margins and curves of pages, a kind of gentle humor that only revealed itself if one chose to truly look. His brush moved with absolute certainty as he painted the creature, a small rabbit, rendered in browns and reds, no bigger than a fingernail. The work was so detailed that it required him to lean close, his breathing shallow, his entire attention narrowed to the space no larger than a grain of barley. This was the deepest part of the work, the part where the world fell away and there was only the brush, the pigment, the parchment, and the image forming beneath his fingers. When he finally set down his brush, the creature was complete. The rabbit seemed to peer out from the letter with an almost knowing expression, as if it shared some secret with the person patient enough to find it. Thomas sat back and allowed himself a small smile, a quiet curl at the corner of his mouth, the gentle humor that had sustained him through 51 years of careful, deliberate work. The light was shifting now, moving toward amber. In perhaps an hour, the bell for sext would ring, and he would set aside his work, carefully covering his pigments with cloth to protect them from dust, rising to make his way to the choir for midday prayer. But for now, there was still time to rest his eyes, to observe what he had created, to let the satisfaction of good work settle into his bones like warmth. He stood and walked to the window, moving slowly as he always did. His joints were not as fluid as they had once been, but the movement was still certain, the rhythm still peaceful. From the scriptorium window, he could see into the cloister below, the covered walkway that ran around the central garden, the low stone wall, the herb beds where the monastery's healer grew her medicines. An apple tree stood in the center of the garden, its leaves turning gold and red, its branches heavy with late fruit. The sight of it filled him with something close to contentment. This is what his life had been, and he would not have changed a moment of it. The colors, the careful work, the quiet hours in the scriptorium with the other monks, the bell that marked the day's rhythm, the knowledge that each page he illuminated would outlast him by centuries. Each letter was an anchor, a permanence, a small rebellion against time's swift current. Thomas returned to his workspace, his movements slow and deliberate. The rabbit he had painted seemed to watch him as he settled back onto his stool, a silent companion in the quiet scriptorium. His ink-stained fingers reached for a fresh vial of pigment, this time a soft green, made from verdigris mixed with a touch of white lead to lighten it, creating a pale celadon tone that reminded him of new spring leaves. The page before him was nearly complete, but there remained the delicate work of the background, the subtle wash of color that would make the illuminated letter seem to float above the parchment rather than sit flat upon it. This was the kind of work that required absolute stillness of mind, the kind of work that Thomas had come to understand as a form of prayer more profound than the words he spoke in the choir. He prepared his wash with meticulous care, grinding the pigment into finer and finer particles, mixing it with a binder of gum arabic and water until the consistency was exactly right, thin enough to flow smoothly from the brush, yet dense enough to lay down true color. The preparation itself was a meditation. His hands moved through the familiar motions, and his breathing slowed to match the rhythm of his work. Humming plain chant melodies under his breath, he lost himself in the ancient melody, the same tune the monks had sung for centuries. Brother Cuthbert glanced up from his binding work, hearing the familiar humming. A small, knowing smile crossed his weathered face. Everyone in the scriptorium recognized Thomas's habit, that quiet singing that accompanied his most delicate work. It was said, though Thomas would never have acknowledged such a thing, that the colors seemed to sing back when Thomas worked in this state, that the pigments seemed to bloom beneath his brush with unusual vitality. The first careful stroke of green wash moved across the parchment. Thomas's hand was steady, his breathing shallow, his entire being concentrated into this single moment. The color flowed from his brush like water, settling onto the vellum, smooth calfskin parchment with perfect evenness. One stroke, then another, building the color gradually, layer by transparent layer, creating depth through patience rather than force. By the time the second layer was complete, the letter seemed to glow. The blues and reds and golds appeared to rise from the page, suspended in space, held aloft by the pale green wash beneath them. It was a small magic, this illusion of depth, but it was built on nothing but careful technique, on understanding how color interacted with color, on knowing when to stop adding and simply allow the work to rest. The afternoon light had deepened to a rich honey color. Dust motes drifted through the scriptorium like small, unhurried travelers with nowhere in particular to go. The warmth of the stone walls seemed to seep out slowly, settling into the air like contentment itself. Thomas became aware, as he sometimes did, of the sheer privilege of this moment, to be alive, to have hands that still obeyed his intentions, to be surrounded by beauty that he himself was creating, one careful brushstroke at a time. A sound drew his attention briefly. Brother Edmund had set down his pen and was stretching his arms, arching his back slightly to ease the strain of hours bent over his copying work. Edmund was younger than Thomas by perhaps 15 years, but his movements carried the same careful quality, the same understanding that the body was a tool to be treated with respect and attention. They exchanged a glance, a wordless acknowledgement of shared weariness and shared purpose, and then Edmund returned to his work. Thomas noticed, as he always did at this hour, that the quality of light was changing. The sun had moved far enough in its arc that the angle was becoming less favorable for detailed work. The colors would begin to shift, their true tones masked by the warmth of the low afternoon sun. This was the natural rhythm of a scribe's day: work intensely in the morning and early afternoon when the light was true and clear, then transition to tasks that required less precise color judgment as the day wore on. He set down his brush and allowed the wash to dry completely. This too was part of the discipline, knowing when to stop, trusting that the work would reveal itself properly in due time. Patience was not merely a virtue in the scriptorium, it was a practical necessity. Rushing led to smudged pigment, to colors bleeding into one another where they should remain distinct, to the kind of careless mistakes that would haunt a scribe for years afterward. While the wash dried, Thomas attended to his materials. This was another habit so ingrained that it required almost no conscious thought. He cleaned his brushes carefully, rinsing them in small bowls of water that he changed frequently to keep the bristles pure. The water turned cloudy with pigment, blues and greens and reds swirling together in a kind of secondary art, beautiful in its own way. He hung the brushes carefully to dry, arranging them bristle up so they would retain their shape. The pigments themselves required careful attention. Precious lapis lazuli, worth more than a laborer's yearly wage, needed to be protected from dust and moisture. Thomas covered each vial with cloth, securing it carefully. The gold leaf, even more precious than the lapis, he stored in a small wooden box lined with paper, handling it as though it were made of spun glass. These materials were not his own. They belonged to the monastery, entrusted to him for the duration of his life as scribe. Part of his deep contentment came from this sense of stewardship, of being the temporary keeper of treasures that would outlast him. The bell for sext rang out across the monastery, its deep bronze voice calling the community to midday prayer. Thomas rose without hurry, his movements careful and measured. His joints were not as young as they once were, but the stiffness from sitting for hours of work loosened as he stood and stretched. He made his way out of the scriptorium, his ink-stained fingers brushing briefly against the cool stone of the doorway in a gesture of farewell. A small ritual he had performed for so many years that it had become invisible to him, yet essential. The cloister was cool and green in the afternoon light. The covered walkway that ran around the inner garden provided shelter from the warm autumn sun, and Thomas's pace slowed even further as he walked toward the church. The abbey bells continued to ring, their sound seeming to come from every direction at once, echoing off the stone walls and filling the entire monastery with their summons. In the choir, Thomas took his place among the other monks, not in the front but in the middle ranks, where he had sat for the past 30 years. The stall next to him held Brother Matthew, who was already in the process of settling himself, arranging his robes, preparing his mind for prayer. No words passed between them. The friendship between Thomas and Matthew was the kind that required no words. It was built on decades of sitting side by side, of sharing the rhythms of monastic life, of understanding without explanation. The cantor began the chant, and Thomas's voice joined in, not loud but steady and true. The plain chant melodies that he had been humming in the scriptorium took on their fuller form here, surrounded by the voices of 60 monks, their harmonies rising into the vaulted stone ceiling and filling the church with a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human effort. This was what the work in the scriptorium was for, Thomas sometimes reflected. The illuminated manuscripts were meant to be read, to be sung, to carry the words of Scripture into the world. His colors were part of a larger whole, a small but necessary part of the monastery's mission. The service lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When it concluded, Thomas remained in his stall for a moment longer, allowing the silence to settle around him like a familiar garment. The church was beautiful in the afternoon light, shadows cast by the stone pillars creating patterns on the floor, dust motes drifting through the colored light from the high windows. He said a small, private prayer, nothing formal, nothing that required words. Simply a feeling of gratitude, directed toward the mystery that he had never felt any need to fully understand. The walk back to the scriptorium took him through the cloister again. The herb garden was in full autumn abundance now. Sister Marjorie, the monastery's healer, was there with 2 of her assistants, harvesting the last of the season's healing plants. Thomas paused to observe them briefly, noting how each of them moved with the same unhurried, purposeful grace that he and Edmund and the other scribes brought to their own work. Whether one was illuminating manuscripts or harvesting herbs, the principle was the same: attention to the task at hand, respect for the materials, and the understanding that good work could not be rushed. Back in the scriptorium, the afternoon light had shifted further. Thomas settled once again onto his stool and examined the page he had been working on. The green wash had dried completely now, and in the softer, more angled light of late afternoon, the colors seemed to have deepened and settled. The letter glowed. The small rabbit in the curve of the Q seemed almost alive, its tiny eyes bright with intelligence. There remained only the finest details now, the kind of work that many scribes found tedious, but which Thomas had come to understand as perhaps the most important part of the entire process. It was in these final touches that a piece of work either achieved a kind of perfection or remained merely competent. The difference was invisible to the casual eye, but it was there nonetheless, a subtle presence that accumulated across centuries as readers encountered the manuscript again and again. He selected a brush so fine that only a few bristles remained, nearly worn away by years of careful use. This brush had been his companion for perhaps 10 years, and he had no intention of replacing it. The bristles had molded themselves perfectly to his hand, understood the exact pressure he preferred to apply, had absorbed into their fibers an almost intuitive knowledge of how to deliver pigment to parchment with absolute precision. The final details were gold leaf highlights, tiny gleams of light placed at the edges of the letter where the eye naturally sought them. These would catch candlelight when the manuscript was read, creating small points of brilliance that would draw the reader's attention to the text's most sacred passages. Gold leaf required a special technique. The parchment had to be prepared with a sticky base, and the leaf had to be pressed carefully with a smooth tool to ensure it adhered completely without tearing or crumpling. Thomas worked with the absolute concentration of a man performing a sacred ritual. Each tiny highlight was placed with deliberation, each one a small decision about where light should live on the page. His breathing was shallow, his mind perfectly clear, his entire being narrowed to this work and nothing else. The world outside the scriptorium, the monastery, the season, his own body with its aches and its age, all of this fell away. There was only the work, the pigment, the parchment, and the image emerging beneath his hands. When the final highlight was placed and pressed smooth, Thomas sat back slowly. The page was complete. The illuminated letter seemed to float above the vellum, surrounded by its pale green wash, decorated with delicate gold highlights and the small hidden rabbit. The text itself, the scripture passage that Brother Edmund had copied, now seemed to glow with new significance, as though the words themselves had been transformed by the beauty surrounding them. He set down his finest brush with the same care he would have used to set down a newborn child. His hands, marked by decades of this work, rested on the edge of his workspace. The satisfaction that filled him now was so complete, so total, that he felt almost weightless with it. This was why he had devoted his life to this work. Not for recognition, few would ever know his name, but for this moment of perfection, this sense that he had created something beautiful and true and enduring. The bell for none, the mid-afternoon prayer, would ring within the hour. Thomas allowed himself the luxury of simply sitting, simply being, simply observing what he had created. The light in the scriptorium was shifting again, becoming more golden, more warm. Soon he would need to set aside his work for the day, to cover his materials, to make his way to the church for afternoon prayer. But for now, there was still time to rest in the presence of this completed beauty. Brother Edmund glanced over at him from his own work and seemed to understand from Thomas's posture and expression that he had just finished something significant. Edmund smiled, a small, knowing smile that said everything that needed to be said. Two craftsmen, acknowledging each other's work, needing no words to convey respect and understanding. The warmth of the afternoon seemed to deepen. The stone walls of the scriptorium held the day's accumulated heat, releasing it slowly into the cool air of the room. Thomas became aware of the scent of the parchment, the faint, almost imperceptible smell of animal skin treated with ancient methods, a smell that had become as familiar to him as the smell of his own skin. He became aware, too, of the faint scent of the pigments, the gold leaf, the binders and bases that had become the substance of his daily work. His contentment, which had never left him truly throughout the day, seemed to deepen and broaden, filling not just his mind but his entire being. This was what a good life looked like, he thought without words. Not excitement, not drama, not the kind of passion that burned bright and burned out. Rather, it was this: steady work, beautiful materials, the companionship of other craftsmen, the knowledge that one's hands could create something that would outlast one's own life by centuries. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The bell for none rang out across the monastery, its deep voice calling the community once again to prayer. Thomas gathered his materials with the same careful attention he always devoted to this task. The pigments were covered, the brushes hung to dry, the gold leaf secured in its protective box. Each action was performed with deliberate care, a small ritual of closure that marked the transition from work to worship. As he rose from his stool, Thomas felt the pleasant weariness that came from hours of focused concentration. His back held a gentle ache. His eyes felt slightly tired from the close work, and yet his mind was clear and settled, at peace in the way that only comes after good work is completed. He made his way out of the scriptorium, pausing briefly at the threshold to glance back at his workspace. Tomorrow he will begin a new page, a new letter, another chance to bring color and light to sacred words. The cloister was quieter now. The afternoon had advanced far enough that the light had taken on a different quality, more orange, more golden, casting longer shadows beneath the arches of the covered walkway. The herb garden was empty now, Sister Marjorie and her assistants having finished their harvesting and withdrawn to the infirmary where the healing work continued indoors. The apple tree in the center of the garden stood alone, its branches still heavy with fruit, its leaves a riot of gold and scarlet. In the church, the afternoon service was brief, a time of prayer and quiet reflection rather than the more elaborate chanting of the morning offices. Thomas found his place in the choir stall and allowed the familiar rhythms to settle over him like a warm cloak. The stone church was cool now, the afternoon light coming through the high windows in thick, visible rays that seemed almost solid enough to touch. Dust motes drifted through these rays of light like tiny travelers moving through golden corridors. Brother Matthew sat beside him, as always, his presence a quiet comfort. The two men had never exchanged more than a few dozen words in 30 years, yet they understood each other with the deep understanding that comes only from shared rhythm, shared silence, and shared purpose. When the service ended, Matthew placed a weathered hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement that seemed to say, "Well done today." Thomas responded with the slightest nod, and that was sufficient. The afternoon remained warm as Thomas made his way back through the cloister. Rather than returning immediately to the scriptorium, he found himself drawn toward the monastery's library, a smaller, quieter space that held the completed manuscripts, the books that represented years and years of labor by scribes long dead. He entered with the reverence one might bring to a sacred space, because to him it was sacred. The library was cool and shadowed, lit only by the narrow windows set high in the stone walls. Shelves lined the space, holding perhaps 200 volumes, a considerable collection for a monastery of this size. Some of the manuscripts were bound in leather, their spines decorated with gold leaf and precious pigments. Others were older still, their bindings worn soft by centuries of handling, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. Thomas moved slowly along the shelves, his fingers trailing lightly across the leather spines. He had illuminated perhaps a dozen of these volumes over the course of his long career. Each one represented months of work, sometimes years. Each letter that bore his hand, his eye, his careful attention, was still here, still visible, still serving the purpose for which it was created centuries ago, to help guide readers into the sacred text, to make the words seem precious through their beautiful presentation. He withdrew one of the older volumes, a psalter that he had worked on perhaps 30 years ago, when his hands were steadier and his eyes sharper. though his understanding of the work was less deep. He opened it carefully, the leather binding creaking with age, and found one of his letters, a large, ornate initial P that began Psalm 95. The letter was surrounded by intricate geometric patterns and tiny creatures hidden in the margins, painted in blues and reds and golds that still gleamed despite the passage of 30 years. Looking at his own work across such a span of time, Thomas felt a strange sense of conversation with his younger self. That young Thomas had understood the technical aspects of the work well enough, but the older Thomas, the Thomas of today, understood something deeper. He understood that the colors themselves were a form of language, that the careful placement of a highlight or shadow could guide a reader's eye and heart, that the hidden creatures and flourishes were a kind of secret communication between the artist and any future reader patient enough to truly look. He returned the Psalter carefully to its shelf and selected another, this one much older, bound in leather that had cracked and faded to a pale brown. The manuscript dated from perhaps 50 years before Thomas had even been born, and he could see in the illuminations the hand of a master scribe, someone whose work had clearly been admired even in his own time. The letters were surrounded by flowing vine work and gold leaf so delicate that it seemed to capture actual sunlight. The creatures hidden in the margins, rabbits, birds, small fantastical beasts, seemed almost alive, rendered with such precision and affection that one could imagine the long-dead artist smiling as he worked. Thomas stood for a long moment, simply observing this older work. There was no envy in his observation, only a deep respect and a sense of connection across time. This scribe, dead for perhaps a century, had worked in much the same way that Thomas worked, had sat at a workspace much like Thomas's own, had ground pigments with a mortar and pestle, had mixed gums and binders, and hummed plain-chant melodies while working. And now, centuries later, Thomas could see his work, could admire it, could feel the presence of that long-dead man through the evidence of his careful labor. This was what immortality looked like, Thomas thought. Not fame, not recognition, but the simple continuation of one's work into the future. The manuscripts would outlast him. The letters he illuminated would be read by people not yet born, in a world he could not imagine. And perhaps, centuries hence, another scribe would stand in a library and observe his work, feeling that same sense of connection, that same respect for the careful labor of another craftsman separated from them by time. He returned the Psalter to its shelf and made his way slowly back out of the library. The afternoon was advancing. Soon the bell for Vespers would ring, calling the community to evening prayer. But there was still time, perhaps an hour, before that call came. Thomas found himself drawn toward the herb garden, where he knew Sister Marjorie would still be working, preparing her healing materials for the evening's work. Sister Marjorie was 30 years old, with work-roughened hands and dark hair streaked through with gray despite her relative youth. She had been the monastery's healer for nearly 8 years, and in that time she had earned a reputation for skill that extended beyond the monastery walls. People came from surrounding villages seeking her remedies and her advice. Yet in the cloister, she was known simply as a woman of quiet competence, someone who went about her work with the same unhurried grace that Thomas brought to his own. She was in the drying shed when Thomas found her, a small stone building attached to the main kitchen where herbs hung from the rafters in bundles, drying slowly in the cooler autumn air. The shed smelled intensely of herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, and a dozen others that Thomas could not name but recognized by scent. Sister Marjorie was carefully stripping dried leaves from their stems, setting the leaves aside in ceramic bowls and discarding the woody stalks into a small pile to be used for fuel. "Brother Thomas," she said, glancing up briefly from her work, "you finished something significant today." It was a statement rather than a question, and it would have seemed like presumption from anyone else. But Sister Marjorie had the gift of seeing, the ability to read people's moods and states as clearly as Thomas read the letters he illuminated. Thomas had observed her do this many times over the years, watching her glance at a patient and immediately know whether they were fevered, whether they were anxious, whether they were approaching their final days. "I have," he replied simply, "a gospel letter. The work came together as it should." Marjorie nodded, returning her attention to her work, though her posture suggested she was listening. "The best work always feels that way," she said, "as though it was already present and one merely revealed it." Thomas settled himself on a low wooden stool near the shed's entrance, not interfering with her work, simply present in the companionable silence that both of them seemed to prefer. He watched her hands as she worked, hands similar to his own, marked by their labor, stained with the evidence of her work, moving with the same unhurried precision that he brought to his own tasks. "Do you ever wonder if it matters?" he asked after a while. "The work we do." Marjorie set down a bundle of dried sage and considered the question seriously, in the way that suggested she did not find it odd or rhetorical. "Every healer wonders that," she said finally. "You cure one person and another falls ill. You prepare remedies and still people suffer and die. But then you see someone who would have died, recovered because of your work. And you know that it matters, even if you can never see the full scope of why." "Yes," Thomas said, "that is precisely it." They remained in companionable silence for perhaps 30 minutes. Thomas watched Marjorie work, observing the careful movements of her hands, the way her mind seemed to be in her work, even as they occasionally exchanged brief observations about the season, the health of various monks, and the approaching winter. By the time the bell for Vespers began to ring across the monastery, Thomas felt deeply settled, as though some question he hadn't quite known he was asking had been answered. He rose to make his way to the church, and Marjorie looked up from her work to offer a small smile. "The world needs people who understand that their work matters," she said. "Don't forget that, Brother Thomas." The evening service was longer than the afternoon one had been, the monks gathering in the golden light of late afternoon to sing the traditional psalms and readings that marked the transition from day to night. Thomas's voice joined the others, steady and true, carrying the familiar melodies that had structured his life for so many decades. The church seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, the stone walls turning warm and almost amber in color. As the service progressed, Thomas felt the weight of the day beginning to settle into his body, the pleasant exhaustion that came from hours of focused work and sustained concentration. His mind began to slow, his thoughts to grow quieter. The ceaseless internal dialogue that usually accompanied consciousness beginning to fade into a gentle hum of contentment. When the service ended and the monks began to disperse, Thomas made his way not to the refectory for the evening meal, but directly to his small cell. This was unusual. Normally he would eat with the community, listening to one of the younger monks read aloud from the lives of the saints while they consumed their simple supper of bread, cheese, and ale. But tonight, he felt drawn toward solitude, toward the quiet space of his own small room. His cell was sparse, as all monastic cells were. A narrow bed, a small table, a wooden chest containing his few possessions. High on the wall, a narrow window looked out toward the cloister garden. Thomas settled onto his bed and gazed out this window, watching the light fade from gold to orange to a deep blue-gray as the sun sank toward the horizon. His hands rested on his lap, ink-stained fingers folded peacefully. The day's work had left him in a state of profound contentment, and as twilight deepened, this contentment seemed to expand and deepen as well, until it encompassed not just the day just completed, but his entire life, all the years of careful work, all the hours spent in the scriptorium, all the manuscripts created, and all the letters illuminated with such care and attention. The bells for compline, the final prayer service of the day, would ring within the hour. But for now, there was just this: the fading light, the quiet of the monastery settling into evening, the deep peace that comes only at the end of a day well lived. Thomas made his way to the church for compline as the last light faded from the sky. The monastery had taken on the quality of a place suspended between day and night, neither fully one nor the other. The stone walls seemed to hold the memory of daylight even as true darkness gathered in the corners of the cloister. A few candles had been lit in the church, creating pools of warm light in the vast shadowed space. The final service of the day was brief and contemplative, a gentle conclusion to the hours of labor and prayer. The monks sang the ancient words that had been sung in this church for centuries, psalms of protection, of rest, of trust in the darkness that would come. Thomas's voice joined the chorus, his mind already beginning to settle into the slower rhythms of evening, preparing for sleep. After the complaint ended, the community dispersed in near silence. There was no talking now. The grand silence of the monastery had begun, a time when no unnecessary words were spoken until after breakfast the following day. Thomas made his way back to his cell, moving slowly through the darkened cloister, his feet finding their way by memory more than sight. In his small room, he lit a single candle from the rushlight that burned near the stairs, a privilege of age, to have a candle rather than relying on a rushlight alone. The flame cast a soft glow across his sparse surroundings, creating shadows that seemed almost alive in their gentle movement. He prepared himself for sleep with the same methodical care he brought to all things, removing his outer robes, folding them carefully and setting them aside, kneeling briefly in prayer at the foot of his narrow bed. As he lay down on his thin mattress, pulling the wool blanket up to his chin, Thomas found his mind drifting back through the day. The morning light in the scriptorium, the precious lapis lazuli, glowing like a piece of captured sky, the small rabbit hidden in the curve of the illuminated letter, the conversation with Sister Marjorie in the herb-drying shed, the old psalter in the library, its colors still gleaming after 30 years. These images moved through his mind like a gentle tide, each one bringing with it a small current of contentment. The candle burned down slowly, and as it did, the shadows in his cell seemed to deepen and expand, becoming less distinct, less defined. The sounds of the monastery settling into night, the distant closing of doors, the fading footsteps of monks making their way to their own cells, grew quieter and more sparse until finally there was only silence. Thomas's breathing slowed. His thoughts, which had been moving in a gentle, meditative progression, began to space themselves further apart, like words growing distant and indistinct. The line between wakefulness and sleep, which had always been somewhat blurred for him, grew softer still. Just before sleep took him fully, a memory surfaced. Himself as a young man, newly appointed as scribe, standing in the scriptorium for the first time. The master scribe, long dead now, had shown him the precious materials, had taught him the basic techniques, and hummed plain-chant melodies as he worked, just as Thomas now hummed. The old master had placed a hand on young Thomas's shoulder and said words that Thomas had carried with him for 50 years. The work we do here is a form of prayer. Let your hands learn to pray. Thomas had let his hands learn to pray. Every brushstroke was a prayer. Every carefully placed highlight, every hidden creature in a margin, every letter brought to life through color and gold. All of it was prayer made visible. And the prayers his hands had spoken would continue long after his own hands had grown too stiff to hold a brush, long after he himself had returned to dust. With this thought settling into his mind like a benediction, Thomas slipped fully into sleep. His breathing became deep and regular, his face peaceful in the candlelight. The shadows around him seemed to settle as well, becoming restful rather than mysterious, protective rather than vast. In the morning, he would rise at the sound of the bell for matins. He would make his way to the church in the darkness before dawn. He would sing the ancient psalms with his brothers. He would return to the scriptorium as the sun rose and begin another day of careful work. But for now, there was only rest, only the deep peace that comes from a day well lived, from work completed with care and attention, from a life spent in service to something larger than oneself. The candle burned lower, its flame flickering gently in the still air of the cell. The monastery around him was utterly quiet now, a place held in suspension between one day and the next, between the labor that had been completed and the labor that would come again. In this silence, in this darkness touched by a single candle's warm glow, Thomas rested, his body at ease, his mind at peace, his hands, those faithful, ink-stained hands, folded peacefully at his sides. And in the scriptorium, waiting on a smooth wooden table for the morning light to reveal it fully, the illuminated letter rested as well. The blues and reds and golds seemed to glow faintly even in the darkness, as though they held within themselves some fragment of the light that had guided their creation. The small rabbit in the curve of the queue seemed almost to breathe. So carefully had it been rendered, so tenderly had it been brought to life by hands that understood that even the smallest details mattered, that even the most hidden creatures deserved the same careful attention, the same love, the same respect. This was Thomas's legacy. Not fame, not recognition, not even the knowledge of most people that he had lived and worked and created beauty. Rather, it was the simple fact that his hands had made something that would outlast him, that would serve beauty and truth long after he himself had returned to dust. It was the knowledge that somewhere in the future another person, perhaps a reader, perhaps another scribe, perhaps simply someone patient enough to truly look, would encounter his work and feel, for just a moment, the presence of the man who had made it. This was enough. This was everything. This was the quiet victory of a life devoted to work done well, to beauty created with care, to the understanding that one's hands could be instruments of prayer, that one's daily labor could be an offering to something larger and more lasting than any single human life. As the candle continued to burn down in Thomas's small cell, the monk slept on, his sleep deep and dreamless and restorative. The monastery around him was wrapped in darkness and silence and peace. The work of the day was done. The work of tomorrow waited. And between these two moments of labor, there was rest, real rest, earned rest, the kind of rest that comes only when one has given one's full attention and care to the work at hand. The light of the single candle grew dimmer. Outside Thomas's cell, the night deepened. Stars began to appear in the small rectangle of the window, cold and distant and eternal. And in his narrow bed, with his hands folded peacefully and his breathing deep and even, Thomas rested in the darkness, held gently by the monastery that had been his home for 50 years, surrounded by the silence that had learned to hold his contentment as carefully as he had learned to hold a brush. In the morning, when the bell for matins rang out across the darkness, he would rise. He would make his way to the church. He would sing the ancient psalms. He would return to his work in the scriptorium, and his hands would remember exactly where to go, exactly what to do, exactly how to bring color and light and beauty to sacred words. But for now, there was only this: the darkness, the silence, the deep peace of a day completed, a life well lived. A small corner of the vast monastery resting in the knowledge that the work would continue, that the prayers spoken through brush and pigment and gold would go on, that the letters illuminated with such care would guide readers through the centuries, carrying within them the love and attention of a single scribe named Thomas, whose name would likely be forgotten but whose work would endure. And this, perhaps, was the greatest beauty of all. The bell for matins rang out through the darkness, its bronze voice calling across the sleeping monastery. Thomas woke not with a start, but with the gentle surfacing that comes from deep rest, his eyes opening slowly, his mind rising gradually toward consciousness like someone floating upward through still water. For a moment, he simply lay in his narrow bed, aware of the cold air touching his face, the weight of the wool blanket across his body, the particular quality of darkness that comes just before dawn. His candle had long since burned down to nothing, leaving only the faint smell of tallow in the air. The window above his bed showed the faintest suggestion of stars, though whether this was the last of the night sky or the first hints of approaching dawn, he could not say. He rose slowly, his body remembering the ritual of more than 5 decades. The cold stone floor beneath his feet brought him fully awake. His breath misted slightly in the chill air as he dressed in the darkness, his fingers finding their way through the familiar motions without need of light. By the time he finished, the faintest gray was beginning to touch the eastern sky beyond his narrow window. The cloister was utterly still as he made his way toward the church. A few other monks could be heard moving through the darkness, quiet footsteps, the soft rustle of robes, but no one spoke. The silence was profound, sacred, the kind of silence that seemed to belong to the night rather than to human voices. The church was lit only by a few oil lamps, their flames creating small pools of amber light that seemed almost to emphasize the vastness of the darkness beyond them. Thomas found his place in the choir stall beside Brother Matthew, who was already settling himself, his movements as familiar and practiced as Thomas's own had become. The service of matins was long. The monks sang through a series of psalms and biblical readings, their voices rising and falling in the ancient patterns that had structured monastic prayer for more than 1,000 years. Thomas's voice joined in, steady and true, though his mind was not fully engaged with the words themselves. Rather, he seemed to exist in a state between sleep and wakefulness, his body performing the familiar rituals while some deeper part of him rested in a kind of meditation. By the time matins ended and lauds began, the second service of the night, the sky beyond the high windows had shifted from black to deep blue. The stars were fading. The first hints of true dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon with the faintest blush of color. Thomas thought, as he sometimes did during these early morning services, about the arc of a single day. How it began in darkness, how light gradually emerged, how the day built toward its fullness of illumination at midday, and then gradually returned to darkness again. It seemed to him a perfect metaphor for a life, beginning in darkness and ignorance, growing gradually toward understanding, reaching some kind of fullness in the middle years, and then gradually returning toward rest and shadow. He was in the shadow years now, he knew, not yet fully in darkness, but moving gradually toward it. The thought did not disturb him. It seemed right, natural, part of the great rhythm of things. He had had his midday brightness. He had done his work. Now it was time for the long, slow decline toward evening and rest. When lauds ended, the monks dispersed to break their fast with bread and weak ale consumed in silence, while one of the younger brothers read aloud from the life of a desert saint. Thomas ate mechanically, his mind already turning toward the day's work ahead. His hands, resting on either side of his wooden bowl, seemed already eager to return to their familiar tasks. By the time the community had finished eating and the bell for prime rang out, the sky had shifted from blue to a pale gray, and the first true light of dawn was beginning to touch the highest stones of the church. The monastery was beginning to wake, to move from the stillness of night into the gentle activity of day. Thomas made his way to the scriptorium as he had done thousands of times before. The room was cool but not cold, lit by the pale gray light of early morning. His workspace was exactly as he had left it the afternoon before, the covered pigments waiting, the brushes hanging to dry, the unfinished page resting on his wooden desk. He paused for a moment before beginning work, simply observing the page in the early light. The illuminated letter he had completed yesterday seemed to glow even more brightly in this soft, diffuse illumination than it had in the afternoon light. The subtle green wash beneath it appeared almost luminous, and the gold leaf highlights caught what little light there was and seemed to generate their own radiance. Before him lay another page, a new one waiting to be begun. Brother Edmund had completed the text the day before, his careful copying creating the black letters that would serve as the foundation for Thomas's color work. A new initial letter, waiting to be brought to life. A new opportunity to demonstrate once again the principles that had guided his work for 50 years. Thomas began his preparations with the methodical care of long practice. He mixed fresh pigments, ground the precious lapis lazuli into fine powder, and prepared the gold leaf base with careful precision. His hands moved through these preparatory rituals with absolute certainty, though he moved slowly, without any sense of urgency or haste. As he worked, he hummed plain chant melodies, the same ones he had sung in the church that morning. His voice was quiet almost to himself, but the sound seemed to settle into the work itself, making his hands steadier, his mind clearer. Brother Edmund, who had arrived in the scriptorium shortly after Thomas, glanced up from his own work and smiled slightly, recognizing the familiar habit. The morning advanced. The light in the scriptorium gradually shifted from gray to a warmer, more golden tone as the sun rose higher. Thomas remained utterly absorbed in his work, his brush moving with the precision of absolute mastery, each stroke placed exactly where it needed to be, each color introduced at exactly the right moment. By mid-morning, the new letter was beginning to take shape. It would be a complex initial, a D with intricate geometric patterns woven through it, with spaces left for small creatures that he would add later. This was the work he loved most, this slow building of complexity from simple elements, this gradual transformation of blank parchment into something alive with color and detail. His contentment deepened as the work progressed. This was what a good life felt like, this sense of being exactly where one belonged, doing exactly the work one was meant to do, with complete understanding of one's materials and complete mastery of one's technique. There was no striving in it, no sense of effort. The work simply unfolded as though it had always existed and he was merely revealing it. Around him, the scriptorium filled gradually with more monks. Brother Cuthbert arrived with his binding work, a younger scribe named Brother Thomas, though everyone called him Young Thomas to distinguish him from the elder Thomas, settled at his own workspace and began copying a different text. The quiet sounds of their work mingled together, the soft scratch of pens on parchment, the gentle clink of pigment vials being moved, the occasional quiet cough or the rustle of pages being turned. This was community, Thomas reflected. Not a community that required constant conversation or interaction, but a community built on shared purpose, on all individuals devoted to the same mission, working in companionable silence toward goals that served something larger than themselves. By noon, when the bell for sext rang out, Thomas had completed perhaps a third of the new illuminated letter. The proportions were established, the major color areas laid down, the basic structure of the design secured. It was enough for one morning's work, more than enough. He set down his brush with the same care he would have used to set down something infinitely precious, and allowed himself a moment of rest. In the refectory, the community gathered again for their midday meal, this time a slightly more substantial fare than the morning's bread and ale. There was thin pottage with vegetables, cheese, and bread. Thomas ate slowly, listening to the young brother who was reading aloud from the life of Saint Catherine. The story was familiar. He had heard it many times over the years, but the young reader brought a certain earnestness to the telling that made it feel new. After the meal, there was a period of time when monks could attend to personal tasks or rest before the afternoon's work. Thomas found himself drawn, as he often was on warm afternoons, toward the cloister garden. The autumn day was pleasant, the sun warm but not hot, the light golden and clear. The apple tree stood in the center of the garden, its branches still heavy with ripening fruit, its leaves shifting gradually from green to gold. He settled himself on a low stone bench beneath the tree and allowed himself to simply sit to rest, to observe the small movements of the garden around him. A sparrow picked at fallen seeds. A butterfly, a late one, lingering past its proper season, moved through the herb beds. The wind moved gently through the apple tree's branches, and occasionally an apple, overripe and ready, would fall to the ground with a soft thud. His ink-stained fingers rested on his lap. The work of the morning had left him in a state of deep satisfaction. Tomorrow there would be more work, and the day after that, and the day after that, until at some point, perhaps years hence, perhaps sooner, his hands would finally become too stiff, his eyes too dim to continue. But that was in the future, and the present moment held only this: the warmth of the autumn sun, the scent of the herb garden, the gentle sounds of the monastery around him, and the deep contentment that came from a life well lived. Sister Marjorie appeared briefly in the cloister, carrying a basket of dried herbs. She paused when she saw Thomas beneath the apple tree and crossed to greet him. Her work-roughened hands were marked with the stains of her labor, bits of green leaf, traces of plant juice, much as his own were marked with ink and pigment. "You are well?" she asked, settling herself on the bench beside him with a sigh that suggested she too had earned rest through her morning's labor. "Deeply well," Thomas replied. "The new work begins well." "All good work begins well," Marjorie said. "It is the continuation that requires faith." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the garden. A breeze moved through the apple tree, and several ripe apples fell, landing softly on the grass below. "Do you remember," Marjorie said after a time, "when Brother Aelred was still infirmarian? He used to tend this garden with such care. He seemed to understand that the work of healing and the work of growing were the same, that both required patience, attention, and faith in processes one could not fully control." Thomas nodded slowly. Brother Aelred had died perhaps 10 years ago, long after he had retired from the position of infirmarian. Thomas remembered him clearly, a gentle man with a quiet voice and hands that seemed to understand the language of plants. "The monastery is full of ghosts," Thomas said softly. "People who have worked here, learned here, died here, but their work remains. The herbs Aelred cultivated still grow. The manuscripts he copied are still read. The lives they lived still shape this place." "Yes," Marjorie said, "and our work will do the same. When we are gone, our hands will have created things that will outlast us. That is a kind of immortality." They sat a while longer, and then Marjorie rose, mindful of her afternoon tasks. She placed a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. the same gesture Brother Matthew had made the day before, and withdrew back toward the infirmary, her step unhurried, her focus already returning to the work that waited. Thomas remained beneath the apple tree as the afternoon advanced. His mind was quiet, his body at rest, his heart at peace. The monastery around him seemed to hold him gently, as it had held him for so many decades. The work waited in the scriptorium. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, the work would wait, and his hands would return to it, and together with those hands, he would continue to speak prayers in color and gold. But for now, there was only this: the warmth of the sun, the scent of apples ripening toward perfection, the knowledge of a good morning's work completed, and the gentle certainty that when the bell for none rang out, he would rise and return to his labor, as he had done thousands of times before, as he would do thousands of times again, until finally his hands grew too stiff and his eyes grew too dim, and another scribe would take his place at the familiar wooden desk. And the work would continue. The colors would flow. The light would be captured in gold leaf. The small hidden creatures would wait in the margins for some patient reader to discover them centuries hence. This was enough. This was everything. This was the quiet victory of a life devoted to prayer made visible through the patient work of two faithful hands. The bell for none rang out across the monastery as Thomas sat beneath the apple tree, and he rose without hurry, brushing a few fallen leaves from his robes. The afternoon light had shifted slightly, becoming warmer, more golden. He made his way slowly back through the cloister, pausing briefly to observe the herb garden, where Sister Marjorie and her assistants could be seen harvesting the last of the season's medicinal plants. The scriptorium welcomed him back as it always did, a space that seemed to recognize his presence, that seemed to settle slightly when he took his familiar place at his workspace. The illuminated letter he had been working on that morning awaited him, the colors already drying to their final brilliance, the structure waiting for the afternoon's more detailed work. Thomas settled himself with the same careful attention he brought to all things. His back was slightly stiffer now from the morning's work, the price of sitting hunched over fine details, but his hands were loose and ready, his mind clear and focused. The afternoon light, streaming through the high windows, was slightly warmer than the morning light had been, but still true enough for color work. He would need to be mindful as the afternoon progressed of the shifting quality of the illumination, but for now, the light was perfect. He began with the fine line work that would outline the major color areas. This was work that required absolute steadiness of hand, absolute clarity of vision. The lines he drew were barely thicker than a human hair, yet they would serve to guide and contain the pigments, creating boundaries that would make the colors seem to glow by contrast. His brush, one of his finest, worn and molded by decades of use, moved with precision, creating perfect lines that seemed almost impossibly thin and delicate. Brother Edmund worked nearby, his pen moving across fresh parchment with the steady rhythm of long practice. The two men had fallen into a rhythm over the years. Edmund would complete a page of text, setting out the black letters with perfect precision, and then Thomas would work on those same pages, bringing color to the initials, adding the details that would make the letters sing. It was a kind of partnership, though they rarely spoke about it. Edmund seemed to understand, through some instinctive knowledge, what kind of work would receive Thomas's attention. He would position the initials in ways that gave Thomas room to work, that allowed his colors and details to flourish without constraint. And Thomas, in turn, understood that Edmund's letters were the foundation upon which all of his own work rested. Without Edmund's perfect copying, Thomas's colors would have nothing to adhere to, nowhere to rest. By mid-afternoon, the basic structure of the new letter was complete. All the color areas were outlined, all the major design elements positioned exactly where they needed to be. Now came the work that Thomas loved most, the layering of pigments, the building of depth, the creation of shadow and light through careful color choices. He selected a deep blue, not the precious lapis lazuli, which he reserved for the most important highlights, but a more modest blue made from indigo, mixed to a particular consistency that he had perfected over decades. The pigment flowed from his brush like water, settling onto the parchment in smooth, even strokes. As he worked, he seemed to enter a state that was neither quiet sleep nor quite wakefulness, a kind of meditative trance in which his conscious mind stepped back and allowed his hands to work according to the knowledge they had accumulated over 50 years. His humming returned, the plain chant melodies that seemed to accompany his best work. The tune was ancient, sung in the monastery's choir since long before Thomas was born, and it seemed to carry within it the voices of all the monks who had sung it across the centuries. As he hummed and worked, Thomas sometimes felt as though he was not alone in the scriptorium, that there were other craftsmen there with him, other scribes from other centuries, all working in the same patient way, all devoted to the same mission of bringing sacred words to life through color and careful attention. Young Thomas, the scribe who shared his name, glanced up from his copying work. The elder Thomas was aware, though not distracted by it, of the younger man's observation. He had noticed long ago that young monks often paused in their work to watch him, drawn by something they could not quite name. Perhaps they recognized in his work a kind of mastery that gave them hope, that suggested that if one simply worked long enough, paid attention deeply enough, devoted oneself completely enough to the craft, such mastery might be achieved by anyone. By the time the afternoon began to shift toward evening, the light taking on that particular golden quality that marked the approach of sunset, the letter was nearly complete. All the major color work was done. The blues and reds and greens had been laid down in their proper places, creating a kind of visual music, a harmony of colors that seemed to sing together on the parchment. What remained now was the finest detail work, the gold leaf highlights, the tiny creatures that would hide in the margins, the delicate line work that would define and sharpen the major forms. This was work that could only be done in the best possible light, with absolute concentration and absolute steadiness of hand. Thomas set down his brush and allowed the letter to dry completely before beginning the final phase of work. He rose and walked to the window, looking out over the cloister. The angle of the sun had shifted so that it was now shining into the covered walkway, creating alternating stripes of light and shadow on the stone floor below. The herb garden was partly in shadow now, the long afternoon shadows of the cloister arches lying across the growing plants like careful brushstrokes. Brother Matthew was there, Thomas noticed, sitting on a low bench with a basket of vegetables he was apparently preparing for the kitchen. The old monk moved slowly, his joints stiff from the morning's prayer services and a lifetime of work, but his movements held the same unhurried quality that marked all the monks of this monastery. Matthew paused in his work occasionally to simply sit, his hands resting on the vegetables, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as though he was engaged in some form of prayer or meditation that required no words. This was what the monastery had taught Thomas over the decades, that work itself could be a form of prayer, that attention to one's labor was a form of devotion, that the act of bringing beauty into the world, even in small ways, even in ways that no one but God might ever truly notice, was a kind of sacred act. He returned to his workspace and began the final phase of work. The gold leaf highlights required absolute precision. First, the parchment had to be prepared with a sticky base, a mixture of gum and white lead that would adhere the delicate leaf to the surface. Thomas applied this base with the finest brush, creating tiny dots and lines of gold where he wanted the highlights to be. Each placement was deliberate, considered, part of a larger design that he seemed to hold entirely in his mind. Then came the gold leaf itself. Thomas worked with such delicacy that the leaf barely seemed to exist beneath his careful touch. A small square of the precious material, pressed gently against the sticky base with a smooth tool, adhered perfectly to the parchment. Another square placed beside it, then another, building up a pattern of gleaming highlights that seemed to capture actual light and hold it suspended on the page. His contentment deepened as the work progressed. There was something almost meditative about this final phase, the absolute focus required, the absolute care, the knowledge that one single careless movement could irreparably damage the work of hours. Yet paradoxically, this intensity of focus seemed to create a state of perfect calm, as though the stakes themselves, so high that they transcended fear, simply dissolved into pure presence. By the time the bell for Vespers rang out, the letter was complete. Thomas set down his final tool and simply sat for a moment, observing what he had created. The illuminated letter seemed to float above the parchment, surrounded by its carefully applied colors, studded with highlights of gold leaf that seemed to glow with internal light. Hidden in the margins were the small creatures, a rabbit, a bird, a small fantastical beast with wings and a long tail, each one rendered with such care and affection that one almost expected them to move, to breathe, to come alive before one's eyes. This was the work. This was what 50 years of devotion had produced. Not just this single letter, but the understanding that lay behind it, the mastery that made it possible, the knowledge that could guide one's hands through such delicate work without hesitation or error. It was a knowledge that could not be taught in words, only learned through the patient repetition of the work itself, year after year, decade after decade, until finally one's hands understood what one's mind could never fully comprehend. He covered his materials carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. The brushes were cleaned and hung to dry. The precious pigments were covered and protected. The gold leaf was stored safely in its protective box. The workspace was left exactly as it should be, clean, organized, ready for tomorrow's work. In the church, the evening service began as Thomas took his place in the choir. The light streaming through the high windows had taken on that particular quality of late afternoon, golden, almost amber, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The monks sang the traditional psalms of evening, their voices rising and falling in patterns that had been established for more than 1,000 years. Thomas's voice joined in, steady, true, without strain. His mind seemed to be partly in the singing, partly still in the scriptorium, still observing the completed letter, still aware of the satisfaction of work well done. The two states seemed to exist simultaneously without contradiction. He could be fully present in the service while simultaneously resting in the contentment of completed labor. After Vespers ended, Thomas made his way not immediately to the refectory, but instead to the library. He had been drawn there increasingly in recent days, as though some part of him was making a kind of final tour through the collection of manuscripts that represented the work of generations of scribes. Tonight he withdrew a volume at random, an antiphonal, a large book used during the singing of the office. It was old, perhaps 60 or 70 years, bound in leather that had cracked and faded with age. He opened it carefully and found within the illuminated initials and decorated margins that marked every major section some of the work he recognized as his own from his younger days, when his style had been less assured, less confident. Other letters had clearly been done by other hands, scribes long dead, whose work lived on in the continued use of the manuscript. He observed one illuminated letter closely, a work that appeared to have been done perhaps 40 years ago, judging by the style. It was lovely work, careful and precise, decorated with small creatures and geometric patterns. The unknown scribe who had created it had clearly understood the principles of the craft and had devoted careful attention to the work. And yet, comparing it with his own recent work, Thomas could see the progress that time and practice and devotion had brought. His newer work had a quality of ease about it, a mastery that could only come from decades of repetition. This too was part of the teaching of the monastery. That improvement came not from sudden inspiration or natural talent, but from the patient, day after day devotion to one's craft. That mastery was not a destination to be reached, but a process to be engaged in continuously, without expectation of final arrival. He returned the antiphonal to its shelf and selected another volume, a psalter this time, bound in leather that was still relatively supple, suggesting it was perhaps 30 years old. Opening it, he found pages that bore his own unmistakable hand. The letters were beautiful, confident, decorated with the kind of confident flourishes that suggested a craftsman who had fully mastered his art and was now beginning to understand how to go beyond mere mastery into something closer to poetry. The memory returned to him of the day he had completed these pages. It had been autumn then as well, decades ago. His hands had been younger, his eyes sharper, though his understanding of the work had been less deep. And yet the letters he had created then had endured, had continued to serve their purpose, had guided readers through sacred texts for 30 years, and would continue to do so for perhaps another 100 years or more. This was the true miracle of the work, Not that it was beautiful, though it was, but that it endured. That his hands, long after they had grown stiff and weak, would continue to speak through the letters they had created, would continue to guide readers, would continue to carry out the mission for which they had been made. He left the library as the evening deepened toward night. The cloister was quiet now, the monks having dispersed to their various evening tasks. In the refectory, there was a simple meal consumed in silence while one of the younger brothers read aloud from a sermon. Thomas ate slowly, his mind already beginning to prepare for sleep, his body beginning to feel the pleasant weariness that came from a full day of focused work. After the meal, he made his way to his cell, performing the same evening ritual that he had performed thousands of times. The candle was lit. The evening prayer was said. And then, finally, he settled into his narrow bed, pulling the wool blanket up to his chin, preparing himself for the sleep that would restore him for tomorrow's work. As sleep began to approach, his mind drifted back through the day. The morning light in the scriptorium. The new letter is beginning to take shape. The afternoon's careful work on the gold leaf highlights. The completed letter, floating above the parchment like a small miracle. The evening service, with the monks' voices rising in ancient harmony. The library, with its shelves of manuscripts created by generations of devoted craftsmen. Each image seemed to settle into him like water settling into earth, each one bringing with it a quiet contentment, a sense of rightness, a feeling that his life had been well spent, that his hands had done good work, that the time given to him had been used well. Outside his cell, the monastery settled into the darkness of night. The bells had ceased their ringing. The monks were in their cells, preparing for sleep or already deep in slumber. The stone walls held the quiet like water holds light, protecting it, preserving it, allowing it to exist without disturbance. And in the scriptorium, waiting on a wooden desk for the morning light to reveal its full beauty, the illuminated letter rested, the work of Thomas's patient hands, the prayer of a craftsman made visible in color and gold, the small miracle that had required a full day's work to create and would serve its purpose for centuries to come. Thomas woke in the deep darkness before dawn, as he had woken thousands of times before, without need of bells or external summons. His body knew the rhythm of the monastery so completely that it woke itself at the proper hour, ready for the day's beginning. He lay for a moment in the darkness, aware of the profound silence that surrounded him. This was his favorite time, the hour before matins, when the monastery was suspended between night and day, when the world seemed to exist in a state of pure potential, waiting to become whatever the coming day would make it. Rising slowly, he dressed in the familiar darkness, his fingers finding their way through the motions without need of light. By the time he made his way toward the church, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky with the faintest suggestion of color. The service of matins unfolded as it always did. The monks gathered in the darkness, their voices rising to sing the ancient psalms. Thomas's voice joined in, steady, true, carrying the weight of 50 years of these same services, these same words sung in the same way. The meaning of the words seemed to deepen the more times one sang them, as though layers of understanding accumulated with each repetition, like sediment building up over time. After matins and lauds, after the community had broken their fast with bread and weak ale, Thomas made his way to the scriptorium as the first true light of dawn was touching the highest points of the monastery's buildings. But today, something was different. As he approached the scriptorium, he noticed Brother Edmund sitting on a bench near the entrance, his face pale, his movements slow and careful. Edmund was holding one hand against his chest, as though gripping something within. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said, concern immediately evident in his voice. "Are you well?" Edmund looked up, and Thomas could see in the younger scribe's eyes something that spoke of pain being carefully managed, of discomfort being borne with the quiet acceptance that the monks had learned to bring to all things. "My chest," Edmund said simply. "Since the middle of the night, I came to the scriptorium hoping the familiar work might settle it, but I find I cannot focus." Thomas understood immediately. He had seen enough monks reach the end of their lives, had sat with several during their final illness, to recognize the particular quality of Edmund's distress. This was not a simple ailment that would pass with rest. This was something deeper, something that suggested the body was beginning its final work of letting go. "You should rest," Thomas said gently. "The work will wait." Edmund shook his head slowly. "I have perhaps a week, perhaps less. I can feel it. I would prefer to work for as long as I am able, but I find I cannot manage the copying today. Perhaps you might allow me to sit near you in the scriptorium, simply to be there, to be near the work, even if I cannot do it myself." Thomas helped Edmund to his feet and supported him as they made their way into the scriptorium. The younger scribe, young Thomas, was already there, beginning his own copying work. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Edmund's condition, but he said nothing, simply offered a quiet nod of acknowledgement and returned to his work. Thomas settled Edmund in a comfortable position near the window, where the light was good, and where the older scribe could observe the work without needing to participate in it. Edmund seemed to relax slightly once he was settled, his breathing becoming easier, his face taking on a quality of quiet acceptance. For the next several hours, Thomas worked as he always did. The new letter that he had been illuminating was now ready for the final details, the tiny decorative elements that would complete the design. But today, his work felt different. It felt somehow like he was working not just for the satisfaction of the craft, but for Edmund as well, as though by performing the familiar ritual with complete devotion, he was honoring both the work itself and the presence of his dying brother. His hands moved with absolute steadiness. The brush seemed to know exactly where to go, what to do. The pigments flowed as though guided by something beyond his conscious intention. And all the while, he was aware of Edmund watching, observing, perhaps taking in one final time the work that had been the substance of his life. By midday, when the bell for sext rang out, the letter was complete. Thomas set down his brush and turned to observe Edmund, who had remained utterly still throughout the morning, his eyes never leaving the work. "It is beautiful," Edmund said softly. "More beautiful than I remember your work being even a few years ago. You have continued to deepen." "As have you," Thomas replied, though he knew this was not strictly true. Edmund's copying had remained excellent but unchanging for the past 15 years or so. It was Thomas who had continued to grow, to develop, to discover new possibilities within the familiar craft. They made their way slowly to the refectory for the midday meal. Edmund ate very little, but he seemed content to sit with the community, to be part of the shared silence and the shared meal. After eating, he expressed a desire to rest, and Thomas helped him to the infirmary, where Sister Marjorie was already waiting. Marjorie took one look at Edmund and seemed to understand immediately the nature of his condition. "How long?" she asked, not unkindly. "Perhaps a week," Edmund said. "Perhaps less. I can feel it clearly now." Marjorie nodded and helped him to one of the beds in the infirmary, a small room kept for monks who were ill or dying. She made him comfortable with practiced efficiency, preparing a medicinal tea that she seemed to know would ease at least some of his discomfort. Over the following days, Edmund's condition deteriorated gradually. He remained conscious and aware, but his ability to move about the monastery diminished. He spent most of his time in the infirmary, though he seemed to take comfort in receiving visitors, monks who would sit quietly beside him, sometimes speaking, more often simply being present in companionable silence. Thomas visited every afternoon after his work in the scriptorium. He would sit beside Edmund's bed and simply be there, the two men communicating through gestures and the occasional quiet word rather than through lengthy conversation. Edmund seemed to find peace in these visits, as though the presence of another craftsman, another person who understood the substance of his life's work, helped him find meaning in what was coming. On the 4th day of Edmund's illness, Thomas brought with him one of the completed manuscripts that Edmund had copied years before. The younger scribe, now no longer so young, Thomas reflected, had completed the text for this particular antiphonal 15 years ago, and Thomas had illuminated the initials. Edmund held the manuscript with trembling hands and looked through it slowly, observing his own work with the kind of objectivity that only comes when looking back across a significant span of time. "It is good work," he said finally. "I had almost forgotten how good it was. It is strange to see one's own labor from such a distance." "It will be used for perhaps another 100 years, Thomas said. "Long after both of us are gone, your copying will still be guiding readers through the words of Scripture." Edmund seemed to take comfort in this. He held the manuscript for a long time, his eyes resting on his own careful letters, the familiar sight of his own hand captured in permanent form. The following day, Edmund was noticeably weaker. He could barely sit up in bed, and his breathing had become labored. Sister Marjorie increased the frequency of her visits, bringing him medicines that seemed designed more to ease his passage than to cure him. The monks began to gather more frequently in the infirmary, understanding that the end was approaching. That evening, after the bell for Compline had rung, Thomas sat beside Edmund's bed in the quiet darkness. A single candle burned, casting a soft glow across the older scribe's pale face. "I am not afraid," Edmund said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This is a good death. In the monastery, surrounded by brothers in a place that has been home, and I leave behind work that will endure. This is all that one can ask for." Thomas took Edmund's hand, work roughened, marked by decades of holding a pen, now fragile and cold. "Yes," he said, "this is a good death indeed." Edmund's eyes closed, and his breathing seemed to slow further. Thomas remained beside him throughout the night, sitting in the quiet darkness, his hand resting gently on his brother's arm. In the early morning, just as the first light of dawn was touching the eastern sky, Edmund's breathing simply stopped. There was no struggle, no final moment of distress, simply a gradual slowing and then an absolute stillness. Sister Marjorie, who had been watching nearby, came and placed a gentle hand on Edmund's forehead, and then nodded to Thomas. Edmund had gone. His work was complete. The monastery seemed to pause for a moment when the news spread. Edmund had been a familiar presence, a brother, a skilled craftsman whose careful work had been part of the monastery's mission for more than 30 years. The bells tolled to announce his death, a simple tolling that would continue at intervals throughout the day, marking his passing to all who heard. The funeral mass was held the following day. Edmund's body was wrapped in a simple shroud, the same shroud that would eventually wrap all of them, and placed in the monastery's church. The community gathered to sing the ancient prayers for the dead, their voices rising in the familiar harmonies that had marked so many deaths before this one. Thomas found himself thinking, as he sang, about the continuity of the monastery. Edmund was gone, but the work continued. Young Thomas would continue to copy, and when young Thomas eventually died, another scribe would take his place. Thomas himself would eventually die, and someone else would sit at his workspace and bring color and light to sacred words. This was not sadness. Rather, it was a kind of peace, the understanding that one was part of a larger continuity, that one's work was not just one's own but part of something that stretched backward through centuries and would stretch forward through centuries yet to come. That afternoon, Thomas returned to the scriptorium for the first time since Edmund had fallen ill. The workspace beside his own, Edmund's workspace, was empty now, the tools put away, the materials stored. But the work that Edmund had been copying remained, the pages ready for Thomas to illuminate when the time came. Thomas settled himself at his own workspace and began a new letter. His hands moved with the familiar motions, the familiar precision. And as he worked, he hummed plain chant melodies, not just his own humming, but seeming to carry within the sound something of Edmund's presence as well, the voices of two craftsmen blending together in the quiet of the scriptorium. The afternoon light was beautiful, golden and clear, the kind of light that seemed to encourage good work. Thomas lost himself in the work, his consciousness narrowing to the space between himself and the parchment, between the brush and the pigment, between intention and execution. By the time the bell for Vespers rang out, he had completed a significant portion of the new letter. The color work was done, the basic design established. Tomorrow or the day after, he would add the final details, the gold leaf highlights, the hidden creatures in the margins. But for now, the day's work was complete. Edmund's funeral had taken place. His body would be buried in the monastery's cemetery, in the ground beneath the cloister, becoming part of the place that had been his home for so many years. and the work would continue. Tomorrow, Thomas will return to the scriptorium. He would continue to bring color and light to sacred words. He would continue to hide small creatures in the margins, tiny surprises waiting for patient readers to discover them. And somewhere in the mysterious continuity of the monastery, Edmund's presence would remain, in the manuscripts he had copied, in the memory of his careful work, in the understanding that he too had spent his life bringing beauty into the world, one careful letter at a time. The days following Edmund's funeral settled into a new rhythm. The scriptorium continued its work, but the space beside Thomas's own workspace remained empty. Young Thomas, who was perhaps 45 years old now, Thomas reflected, and no longer so young, had gradually taken on more of the copying work, stepping into the role that Edmund had held. Yet there was no sense of replacement, no feeling that Edmund was being forgotten. Rather, it seemed to Thomas that the younger scribe was simply continuing what Edmund had begun, carrying forward the work as it had been carried forward through generations of monks before them. Thomas found, in the weeks following Edmund's death, that his work took on a new depth. It was as though Edmund's passing had clarified something for him about the nature of his own labor. He was not simply creating beautiful things for their own sake. He was participating in a kind of sacred transmission, passing knowledge and skill and understanding forward to the next generation, ensuring that when his own hands finally grew too stiff to work, there would be other hands ready to continue. Young Thomas often paused in his own work to watch the elder Thomas illuminate, and Thomas began to understand that this observation was itself a form of teaching. The younger scribe was learning, not through instruction but through proximity, absorbing through his eyes and his presence the principles that guided Thomas's work. One afternoon, perhaps 2 weeks after Edmund's funeral, Thomas found himself working on a particularly complex letter, an ornate initial P that would begin a psalm of praise. The letter required extensive planning, multiple layers of color, intricate geometric patterns, and space for the hidden creatures that were Thomas's subtle signature throughout his work. As he worked, Thomas became aware that young Thomas had set aside his own copying and was observing intently, his eyes following every movement of Thomas's brush, every decision about color placement, every moment when Thomas paused to assess his work before continuing. When the afternoon bell for none rang out, and Thomas set down his brush to allow the work to dry, the younger scribe approached. "Brother Thomas," young Thomas said, and the title of address seemed weighted with respect that had perhaps deepened since Edmund's death. "Might I ask you something about your method?" Thomas turned to observe the younger man. "Of course, ask what you will." Young Thomas gestured toward the letter Thomas had been working on. "I observe that you pause frequently to assess your work, but you never seem to doubt. You pause, you observe, and then you continue with absolute certainty. How is it that you have achieved such confidence?" It was a profound question, one that Thomas had never been directly asked before, though he had sometimes wondered if others noticed this quality in his work. He considered carefully before answering. "When I was younger," Thomas said slowly, "I was full of doubt. I would complete a section of work and then agonize over whether it was correct, whether the colors were true, whether I had made errors. This doubt slowed me down considerably and often led me to make changes that were not improvements but merely expressions of my own anxiety. He paused, selecting his next words carefully. Over the years, I came to understand that doubt was not wisdom but merely the absence of knowledge. And knowledge comes only from repetition, from doing the same work again and again, until one's hands understand the principles so completely that they no longer require conscious thought to apply them. Now when I pause to observe my work, I am not doubting. I am simply observing what is already known to be true. The pause is not a moment of uncertainty, but a moment of confirmation. Young Thomas listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. But what of the mistakes? Surely, even with great experience, one sometimes makes errors. Yes, Thomas acknowledged. One does make errors, but errors become apparent quickly, and when one understands the principles deeply enough, one can usually correct them before they become irreversible. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, what appears to be an error at first glance turns out to be a happy accident, a deviation from the planned design that improves the work in ways one had not foreseen. The younger scribe nodded slowly, seeming to absorb this wisdom not just intellectually, but in some deeper way, as though he was beginning to understand that mastery was not about achieving perfect control, but about developing such deep knowledge that one could respond fluidly to whatever circumstances arose. That evening, as Thomas made his way to the refectory for supper, he found himself thinking about the transmission of knowledge. Edmund was gone, but young Thomas remained, and through young Thomas, the understanding that Edmund had carried and that Thomas carried would be transmitted to the next generation. This was how it had always worked in the monastery. Each generation of monks learned from the previous one, absorbing not just technique but understanding, not just skill but the philosophy that underlies the skill. And somehow, through this gradual transmission, the monastery remained constant even as individual monks came and went, lived and died. In the refectory, the community gathered for the evening meal. One of the younger brothers was reading aloud from a text, a story about one of the desert fathers, ancient monks who had lived lives of extreme simplicity in the Egyptian desert centuries ago. The story told of a monk who had devoted himself to a single spiritual practice for 40 years, repeating the same prayer thousands of times daily. Thomas listened with half his attention, his mind partly elsewhere, but something about the story seemed to resonate with his own experience. The desert father had not pursued perfection or enlightenment in some dramatic way. He had simply devoted himself to the same practice, day after day, year after year, trusting that through repetition and attention, something would be revealed. This was what Thomas had done with his illumination. He had not pursued mastery in some ambitious way. He had simply shown up to his workspace every day for 50 years, had done the work that was placed before him with as much care and attention as he could bring to it. And somewhere in that long continuity of effort, mastery had emerged. After the meal, Thomas made his way back to his cell, but rather than immediately preparing for sleep, he found himself drawn toward the library once again. There was something he wanted to look at, a manuscript from earlier in his career that he had not examined in many years. The library was quiet, lit only by the fading light of dusk coming through the high windows. Thomas moved slowly along the shelves until he found the volume he was seeking, a psalter that he had illuminated approximately 30 years ago. Opening it carefully, he found the work he remembered, careful, precise, beautifully executed, but lacking some of the depth and richness that his later work had developed. The letters were perfect in their technical execution, but they seemed somehow constrained, as though the artist had been working within certain boundaries that he had not yet learned to transcend. Looking at this older work, Thomas could trace the entire arc of his development as a craftsman. The earliest pages showed technique without full understanding. The middle sections showed growing confidence and developing individual style. The later pages showed mastery, that state where technique had become so internalized that it no longer constrained creativity, but rather enabled it. And yet, looking at those earliest pages, he could also see the seeds of everything that would come later. The care was already there. The attention was already there. The devotion to the work was already evident. What had changed over 30 years was not the fundamental approach, but the depth of understanding that underlay it. He returned the psalter to its shelf and withdrew another, this one from perhaps 15 years ago. This volume showed a different stage of development, midway through his long career. The work was confident and beautiful, but still somewhat restrained compared to his most recent pieces. Yet it also held a certain quality of youthful vitality that some of his more recent work had perhaps lost, as his hands had begun to feel the weight of age. Thomas realized, observing these manuscripts across time, that there was no single point at which one achieved mastery. Rather, mastery was a continuous process of deepening, of understanding more fully with each repetition, of gradually expanding the boundaries of what was possible within one's craft. He was still developing, even now at 51 years old. He was still learning. Every letter he illuminated taught him something new, even if that learning was so subtle that he could barely articulate it to himself, let alone to others. This thought brought him comfort. It meant that his work was not finished, that there was still more to discover, still more to understand. Even if his hands eventually grew too stiff to work, he would have spent his entire life in a process of deepening understanding, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The following morning, Thomas woke in the pre-dawn darkness and made his way to the church for matins, as he had done thousands of times before. The familiar rhythms of prayer seemed to settle him more deeply than usual. Perhaps it was the awareness of mortality that Edmund's death had brought, or perhaps it was simply that age was teaching him to appreciate each day more fully, knowing that there were fewer days remaining than had already been lived. After the community had broken their fast, Thomas made his way to the scriptorium as the first light of day was touching the monastery's highest stones. Young Thomas was already there, waiting, and for the first time, he had brought his own materials, pigments, brushes, gold leaf, and had set up a small workspace beside his copying desk. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday," young Thomas said quietly. "About knowledge coming through repetition. I thought, Perhaps it was time to begin learning to illuminate as well as to copy. If you would be willing to teach me. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth, a sense of rightness. This was exactly how it should happen, not through formal instruction, but through proximity, through observation, through the younger craftsman's own recognition that he was ready to deepen his understanding. "Yes," Thomas said simply, "I would be honored to teach you." And so began a new phase in Thomas's work. The afternoons that had been devoted solely to his own illumination now included time spent showing young Thomas the basic principles of color mixing, of brush technique, of the careful preparation of materials. It was slow work, requiring patience, requiring Thomas to articulate principles that he had absorbed so completely over the years that he no longer consciously thought about them. Yet it was also deeply satisfying work. There was something profound about passing knowledge forward, about seeing the younger man's eyes light up as he began to understand how pigments could be mixed to create specific colors, how the angle of the brush could create different effects, how patience and attention could produce work of genuine beauty. Weeks passed. Autumn has advanced toward winter. The herb garden, which had been so productive in the early fall, began to decline as the cold weather approached. Sister Marjorie and her assistants harvested the last of the season's plants, preparing medicines and remedies that would sustain the monastery through the long winter months. Thomas continued his work, illuminating letter after letter, page after page. And beside him, young Thomas gradually began to understand the principles of the craft. His first attempts at illumination were clumsy, uncertain, but they showed promise. More importantly, they showed the fundamental qualities that mattered most: care, attention, devotion to the work. One afternoon, as the light was beginning to fade toward evening, young Thomas completed his first illuminated letter, a simple initial D, decorated with basic geometric patterns and a small creature hidden in the margin. It was not perfect. There were minor flaws, small imprecisions that more experienced eyes would notice. And yet it was beautiful in its own way. Beautiful in the care that had gone into its creation, beautiful in the knowledge that a young craftsman was beginning to understand the principles that would guide his work for decades to come. Thomas examined the letter carefully, taking time to observe it fully before offering his assessment. "This is good work," he said finally. "Better than I would have expected for a first attempt. You have understood the fundamental principles. Now you must simply practice, hundreds and hundreds of times, until your hands understand what your mind already knows." Young Thomas seemed to glow with quiet pride at this assessment. He would go on to become a skilled illuminator. Thomas could see that clearly. Perhaps not as skilled as Thomas himself had become. That would require 50 years of devoted practice, but skilled enough to carry forward the tradition, to pass on what he learned to the next generation, to ensure that when Thomas himself finally set down his brush for the last time, the work would continue. The bell for Vespers rang out across the monastery, calling the community to evening prayer. Thomas set aside his work and rose slowly, his joints protesting slightly after hours of sitting hunched over fine details. But the protest was mild, manageable. His body still served him reasonably well, still allowing him to do the work that mattered most. As he made his way toward the church, Thomas reflected on the curious paradox of his life. He had devoted himself completely to work that would not make him famous, that would earn him no recognition in the wider world, that would leave behind no monument bearing his name. And yet his life felt completely full, completely meaningful, completely satisfying. The illuminated letters he had created would outlast him by centuries. The knowledge he was passing to young Thomas would be carried forward by that young man, and eventually by others after him. The monastery itself, which had been his home and his entire world for 50 years, would continue long after he was gone, sustained by the work of monks yet unborn, kept alive by the dedication of those who came after. In the church, as the monks began to sing the evening psalms, Thomas added his voice to theirs. The words were ancient, sung in this same church for more than 100 years, and in other churches for hundreds of years before that. The melodies were beautiful and familiar, and his voice knew them so completely that he could sing them almost without thought, allowing his mind to rest even as his voice rose in harmony with his brothers. This was what a good life looked like. Not excitement or achievement in the worldly sense, but the quiet satisfaction of devoted work, the peace of knowing that one had spent one's days in service to something larger than oneself, the understanding that one's efforts, no matter how humble, were part of a great continuity stretching backward through centuries and forward into futures that one would never see. Winter came to the monastery with a quiet inevitability. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the cloister into a landscape of white and shadow. The herb garden disappeared beneath its blanket of snow, and the apple tree stood bare and patient, waiting for the spring that was still months away. Thomas's routine continued with the rhythm that had structured his entire adult life. The bells marked the hours, matins in the deep darkness before dawn, lauds as the first light touches the sky, prime as the sun rises fully. And then, finally, the scriptorium, where the winter light, though weaker than the light of other seasons, was nonetheless sufficient for careful work. The cold of winter affected the monastery in subtle ways. The scriptorium, built of thick stone with narrow windows, remained cool but not uncomfortably so. The real challenge was in the materials themselves. The ink seemed to flow differently in the cold. The pigments required more careful mixing to achieve the proper consistency. The gold leaf, delicate in all seasons, became even more fragile in the dry, cold air of winter. Yet these challenges were not obstacles, but simply variations on the familiar work. Thomas had illuminated manuscripts through countless winters, had learned through experience how to adjust his techniques to account for the changing seasons. His hands knew these adjustments as automatically as they knew how to hold a brush. Young Thomas, now embarking on his second season of learning to illuminate, found the winter conditions more challenging. His fingers, not yet accustomed to the subtle adjustments required by cold weather, sometimes fumbled slightly with the delicate materials. Yet he persevered with the quiet determination that Thomas had come to recognize as characteristic of those truly devoted to the craft. It is like learning the work all over again, young Thomas said one afternoon, as he struggled to mix a pigment to the proper consistency in the cold air of the scriptorium. Yes, Thomas agreed. The principles remain constant, but the applications must shift according to circumstance. This too is part of the mastery, not to insist that things remain always the same, but to understand the underlying principles deeply enough that you can adapt them as needed. The younger scribe seemed to absorb this wisdom, and gradually, over the course of the winter, his hands began to develop the instinctive adjustments needed for cold weather work. By the time the first hints of spring began to appear in late February, he was producing illuminations that, while still not at the level of Thomas's work, showed genuine competence and developing style. The monastery's life continued its quiet rhythms. In the infirmary, Sister Marjorie tended the monks who fell ill during the winter months, the inevitable colds and ailments that came with the season. Several of the older monks grew particularly ill during a particularly harsh stretch in January, and Thomas found himself spending time in prayer for their recovery, even as he understood, with the clarity that comes from age, that some of them would likely not survive the winter. One of these was Brother Matthew, Thomas's companion of 30 years, the monk who sat beside him in the choir during every service, whose presence had become so familiar that Thomas no longer really noticed it. Until, one morning in late January, Matthew's stall in the choir remained empty. Thomas learned that morning that Matthew had taken ill the previous evening and was now in the infirmary, his condition uncertain. After the community had dispersed following Prime, Thomas made his way to visit his oldest friend. Matthew lay in one of the infirmary beds, his ancient frame seeming even more fragile beneath the heavy blankets. Yet his eyes were clear, and when he saw Thomas, he managed a small smile. "Brother Thomas," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "I wondered if you would come." "Of course I came," Thomas said, settling himself on a low stool beside the bed. "Where else would I be?" Matthew's eyes closed briefly, as though simply speaking had exhausted him. When he opened them again, he seemed to be gathering his thoughts, preparing to say something important. 30 years we have sat together," Matthew said finally. "In the choir, in the refectory, in all the services and all the prayers. And in all that time, I do not think we have spoken more than a few dozen words to each other." "No," Thomas agreed. "We have not needed to speak. We have understood each other without words." "Yes," Matthew said. "That is what I wanted to say to you before I go, that I have understood you, and I think you have understood me. That is a rare thing, Brother Thomas, a rare and precious thing." Thomas reached out and took Matthew's weathered hand. The two men sat in silence for a long time, needing nothing more than this: the presence of one old friend with another, the quiet acknowledgement of a lifetime shared. Matthew died 3 days later peacefully, in the early morning hours when the monastery was still wrapped in darkness. Thomas was not present at the moment of death, but he learned of it when the bells began to toll, announcing Matthew's passing to the community. The funeral mass followed the same patterns as Edmund's funeral had followed, the community gathering to sing the ancient prayers for the dead, the body wrapped in its simple shroud, The knowledge that another of the monastery's members had completed his earthly work and returned to the earth from which he had come. Yet this death seemed to touch Thomas more deeply than Edmund's had. Edmund was younger, and there had been a sense of promise cut short, of work unfinished. But Matthew had lived a long life, had completed his work, had earned his rest. And yet the absence of his presence in the choir, the empty space where he had sat for 30 years, seemed to create a gap that Thomas felt acutely. In the days following Matthew's funeral, Thomas found himself experiencing something he had not felt in many years, a kind of profound weariness that seemed to go deeper than simple physical tiredness. He continued his work in the scriptorium, continued to fulfill his duties in the monastery, but something had shifted in him. One afternoon, about a week after Matthew's death, Thomas found himself sitting in the Cloister garden, beneath the apple tree that had stood there for as long as he could remember. The winter had been hard on the tree. Several of its branches showed signs of damage from heavy snow and ice. Yet it still stood, still held the promise of spring, still waited patiently for the renewal that would come. Sister Marjorie found him there, as though she had known where to look. She settled herself on the bench beside him without speaking, her presence a quiet comfort. "Brother Matthew was a good man," she said after a time. "A simple man, but good. He had a way of accepting things as they came, without complaint or resistance." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "That was his gift. He knew how to wait, how to be present without demanding that things be different from what they were." "You miss him," Marjorie observed. It was not a question. "I do," Thomas admitted. "More than I expected to. We barely spoke, and yet his absence is profound." Marjorie was quiet for a moment, then said, "You are thinking about your own mortality, about how your time will eventually come, as Matthew's has, as Edmund's has." Thomas nodded slowly. He had been thinking about this, though he had not quite articulated it to himself. The deaths of Edmund and Matthew seemed to have awakened something in him, a recognition that his own time was finite, that the days remaining to him were fewer than the days already lived. "I am 51 years old," he said. "My father died at 63. I do not know if I will have many more years remaining." "Perhaps you will," Marjorie said. "Perhaps you will live to be 80. The body holds surprises. But whether you have 10 more years or 30 more years, does it change what you must do with the time that remains?" Thomas considered this carefully. "No," he said finally. "It does not change what I must do. I must continue to do my work. I must continue to illuminate manuscripts, to pass on what I know to young Thomas, to live as I have always lived." "Then that is your answer," Marjorie said gently. "Not to fight against the reality of mortality, but to accept it, and in accepting it, to understand more deeply what it means to devote oneself completely to work that will outlast oneself." She rose slowly and placed a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of blessing and acknowledgement, and then withdrew, leaving him alone beneath the apple tree. Thomas sat for a long time, observing the bare branches, the promise of buds that would emerge in spring, the life that waited beneath apparent dormancy. And gradually, the weariness that had settled over him began to lift, not because the reality of mortality had changed, but because he had accepted it more fully, integrated it into his understanding of what his life meant. When he finally rose to return to the scriptorium, he moved with a lightness he had not felt in days. The afternoon light was already beginning to shift toward evening, but there was still time for some work. There was always still time for work. In the scriptorium, young Thomas was waiting, his own materials arranged, ready for the afternoon's instruction. Thomas settled himself at his workspace and began the final details on the letter he had been working on, the gold leaf highlights, the tiny creatures hidden in the margins. As he worked, he became aware that young Thomas was watching intently, absorbing not just the technique but something else, perhaps the quality of attention, the depth of devotion, the understanding that the work was sacred not because it was difficult or impressive, but because it was done with complete care, complete presence, complete love. "You will become a master of this craft," Thomas said, not looking up from his work. "Perhaps not as quickly as you might wish, but eventually, if you continue as you have begun. And then you will teach others as I am teaching you. And the work will continue forward, carried by hands not yet born, living on in generations that you will never see." Young Thomas seemed to understand that this was not merely instruction, but a kind of blessing, a passing on of the understanding that the work was larger than any individual craftsman, that one's role was simply to carry forward what had been entrusted to one's care. The winter continued its slow progress toward spring. The days grew slightly longer. The snow began gradually to retreat. The monastery continued its ancient rhythms, the bells marking the hours, the monks gathering for prayer, the scriptorium filling each day with the careful work of illumination. And Thomas, now more fully aware of the finite nature of his days, worked with a renewed sense of purpose. Each letter he illuminated seemed precious. Each day of continued ability to work seemed a gift. The small creatures hidden in the margins of the manuscript seemed to hold more meaning, tiny surprises waiting for some future reader, evidence of a craftsman's care carried forward across centuries. In early April, when the first real warmth of spring began to touch the monastery, the apple tree burst suddenly into bloom, an explosion of white flowers that seemed almost miraculous after the long austerity of winter. Thomas stood beneath it one afternoon, observing the transformation, and felt something like gratitude settling into his heart. He was alive. He was still able to work. He still had hands that could hold a brush, eyes that could perceive color, a mind that could understand the principles of the craft. These were gifts, precious and temporary, and he would not waste them through regret or fear of what might come. The work would continue. Spring has come again, and there were letters waiting to be illuminated, colors waiting to be mixed, gold leaf waiting to catch the light and transform it into something beautiful and sacred and enduring. Spring transformed the monastery completely. The apple tree's flowers gave way to new leaves, and the herb garden emerged from beneath its winter covering to display tender green shoots reaching toward the strengthening sun. Sister Marjorie and her assistants began their spring work, replanting, tending, preparing the beds that would feed the monastery through the coming year. With the warmer weather came a lightness to the monastery's atmosphere, as though the community itself had been holding its breath through the winter and could now release it fully. The scriptorium filled with better light as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the days lengthened. Thomas found that he could work longer into the afternoon before the angle of light began to shift in ways that affected color perception. It was during this spring, as Thomas continued his work, and young Thomas continued his gradual progression from student to craftsman, that something unexpected happened. A visitor arrived at the monastery, a young man of perhaps 25 years, travel-worn and clearly anxious about his reception. The visitor requested an audience with the abbot, and his purpose, when it was revealed, surprised the entire community. His name was William, and he was the grandson of a man who had been a scribe in the monastery some 60 years prior. William himself had been trained as a scribe in a scriptorium in a distant cathedral, but he had become dissatisfied with his work there, sensing that something was missing from his understanding of the craft. Through questioning older monks and following various leads, he had heard of the monastery where his grandfather had worked, and he had come seeking to understand what his grandfather had learned in this place, hoping to deepen his own understanding of the craft. The abbot, after consulting with the senior monks, offered William a place in the scriptorium. And so, quite suddenly, there were 3 scribes engaged in illumination work: Thomas, young Thomas, and now William, who brought with him a technical competence from his cathedral training, but a hunger for understanding that went beyond mere technique. Thomas found himself, quite unexpectedly in his 51st year, becoming the teacher not just of one young scribe but of 2. And strangely, rather than finding this exhausting, he found it energizing. The presence of these 2 younger craftsmen, both approaching the work from different angles, both hungry to understand the deeper principles, seemed to awaken something in him. It was William who, one afternoon in late May, asked Thomas the question that would come to define the final phase of his life's work. "Brother Thomas," William said, as the 3 of them were cleaning their materials after a morning of intensive illumination work, "my grandfather spoke of you. He died when I was very young, but I remember him mentioning a monk named Thomas who had taught him something that changed his entire understanding of the work. He said that Thomas had understood something about the relationship between the artist and the sacred that went beyond mere technical skill." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition, a sense of connection reaching backward across decades to a young man he could barely remember. "Your grandfather was named." Thomas searched his memory, and then it came to him. "Oswald, yes. He was here perhaps 40 years ago, a quiet young man with a gift for observing details." "Yes," William said. "That was my grandfather. He left the monastery eventually, married, and had children. But he never stopped practicing his craft, and he never stopped speaking about what he had learned here. My father grew up hearing stories about this monastery, about the scribes who understood that the work was a form of prayer." Thomas set down the brush he had been cleaning and looked at William directly. "What exactly did your grandfather say that I taught him?" William paused, gathering his thoughts. "He said that you taught him that the purpose of illumination was not to create beautiful things for their own sake, but to help readers encounter the sacred text with open hearts. That every detail, every color choice, every placement of gold leaf, every hidden creature in the margins was meant to serve that larger purpose. He said you told him that if he could understand that his work was not about his own skill or his own pride, but about serving the text and the reader, then his work would transcend mere craft and become something sacred. Thomas could not recall speaking these words exactly, and yet he recognized the truth in what William was describing. This was indeed what he understood, what he had come to understand gradually over decades of devoted work. "Your grandfather understood this?" Thomas asked. "Yes," William said, "not immediately, but gradually, as he observed your work and listened to your occasional words, he came to understand it, and he spent the rest of his life trying to embody that understanding in his own work, even after he left the monastery. He became a skilled scribe and illuminator, but more importantly, he became a craftsman who understood that the work was ultimately about service. Service to the text, service to the reader, service to something larger than himself." Over the following weeks, William proved to be an exceptional student. He had the technical skills to understand the mechanics of illumination, but more importantly, he had the philosophical hunger to understand the deeper principles. He asked profound questions, pushed Thomas to articulate understandings that had become so embedded in his practice that he rarely thought about them consciously. "Why," William asked one afternoon, "do you hide the creatures in the margins? Why not make them prominent, make them obvious?" Thomas considered the question carefully before responding. "Because the letters themselves, the text itself, are what matter most. The creatures are an overflow, a kind of secret communication between the craftsmen and those patient enough to truly look. If they were made prominent, they would distract from the primary purpose. But by hiding them, I ensure that they serve as a reward for careful observation, a kind of benediction for those readers who pay close attention." "But how do you know anyone will find them?" William pressed. "I do not know," Thomas admitted. "Perhaps no one will find them. Perhaps they will exist in the margins of these manuscripts for centuries, unseen, unappreciated. And that is perfectly acceptable. I make them not for recognition, but for the simple reason that the work deserves that level of care, that attention, that devotion. If no one ever sees them, the care I invested in creating them is not wasted. It is still there, still present, still part of the work." William seemed to absorb this principle deeply, and Thomas could see it beginning to change how he approached his own work. The younger scribe's illuminations began to develop a quality of depth that suggested he was no longer simply reproducing technique, but beginning to understand the philosophy that underlay it. Young Thomas, observing these interactions between Thomas and William, seemed to take it as a kind of challenge. He began to work with even greater intensity, pushing himself to improve his craft, asking his own probing questions about the principles that guided the work. And Thomas found himself energized by this dynamic. Rather than feeling drained by the demands of teaching two young craftsmen, he felt renewed. His work during this period took on a quality of richness and depth that perhaps surpassed even his best earlier efforts. In June, As the monastery settled into the full richness of early summer, Thomas completed one of his most complex illuminations, an entire decorated page that served as a prologue to one of the Gospels. The page was a riot of color and detail, intricate geometric patterns, flowing vine work, elaborate creatures both real and fantastic, multiple layers of gold leaf that caught and reflected the light in ways that seemed almost to give the page a luminous quality of its own. Young Thomas and William both stood in amazement when Thomas finally set it aside, deeming it complete. "This is the finest work I have ever seen," William said quietly. "It transcends mere illumination. It is almost transcendent. How did you achieve this?" Thomas looked at the page with the objectivity that comes from completing a major work. "I worked with the understanding that this would be my masterwork," he said finally. "Not that it is necessarily the best work I have done, but that it might be the last work I do that reaches this level of completion. And so I poured into it everything I have learned, everything I understand about the craft." He paused, then added, "But more importantly, I worked with the understanding that I was not working for myself or for recognition. I was working for the reader who would encounter this page centuries hence, for the monk who would sing the gospel words associated with these decorations, for the sacred text itself. When one works with that level of intention, when one understands that the work is not ultimately about oneself at all, something else enters the work. Something beyond technique, beyond skill, something sacred." William listened intently, and Thomas could see the younger man beginning to understand, not intellectually, but in some deeper way, the principle that had guided Thomas's work for 50 years. That evening, as Thomas sat in the Cloister garden after the day's work was complete, he found himself thinking about legacy in a new way. He had always understood that his work would outlast him, that the illuminated letters would continue to guide readers long after he was gone. But William's presence, and the knowledge that William's grandfather had carried Thomas's teachings forward into the world beyond the monastery, suggested that legacy extended in other directions as well. The understanding that he had developed, the philosophy that underlay his work, would not disappear when he died. It would live on in young Thomas and William, both of whom would carry it forward to others. The visible work, the illuminated manuscripts, would endure, but perhaps equally important, the invisible work, the understanding, the philosophy, the approach to craft as sacred service, would also endure, passed from craftsman to craftsman across centuries. Sister Marjorie joined him as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden. The apple tree, now heavy with developing fruit, seemed to glow in the golden light. "You are well?" Marjorie asked, settling herself beside him. "Deeply well," Thomas replied. "Better than I have felt in some time. These young men, William especially, are helping me understand my own work more fully. And I am beginning to see that my life's work is not complete when I set down my brush for the final time. It continues in the hands of those I have taught, in the understanding I have passed on." "Yes," Marjorie said. "This is how it always works. We do our work, we pass on what we have learned, and then we let go. The work continues without us, transformed by new hands, new minds, but carrying forward the principles we understood." They sat in companionable silence as the light faded, and the stars began to appear in the sky above them. The monastery around them was settling into the evening. The bells for Compline would ring soon, calling the community to the final prayer service of the day. As Thomas rose to make his way toward the church, he felt a profound sense of completion, even as he knew his work was not yet finished. There were still letters to be illuminated, still manuscripts waiting for his attention. But the urgency he had sometimes felt, the sense that he had to accomplish everything while he still could, had transformed into something else. A kind of peaceful understanding that the work would continue, that what he had started would be carried forward by others, that his role was simply to do his part as well as he possibly could, and then trust the rest to those who would come after. In the church, the community gathered to complain. Thomas's voice joined with the others to sing the ancient prayers, the familiar melodies that had marked the end of countless days across countless years. The words were the same. The melody was the same. And yet, something about singing them now, understanding more fully what his life meant and how it would continue beyond his own death, seemed to give them new resonance, new depth. The night settled over the monastery, and Thomas made his way to his cell, ready for sleep, ready for the next day's work, ready to continue forward into whatever time remained to him, carrying his brush, mixing his colors, creating beauty in service to the sacred text and the readers who would encounter it centuries hence. Summer deepened and ripened. The monastery existed in a state of golden plenty, the herb garden producing abundantly, the orchard heavy with developing fruit, the days long and warm and filled with light that seemed almost endless. Thomas found himself working longer hours in the scriptorium, not from any sense of urgency, but simply because the quality of light invited extended labor. William and young Thomas continued their studies under Thomas's guidance. The dynamic between the three illuminators had developed into something that Thomas recognized as almost sacred, a kind of community of craftsmen united in the pursuit of beauty and service to something larger than themselves. The scriptorium, which had sometimes felt lonely in previous years when Thomas worked primarily alone, now hummed with a quiet energy. It was William who first broached the subject that would come to shape the final phase of Thomas's work. "Brother Thomas," William said one afternoon in late July, as the three of them were preparing their materials for the day's work, "I have been thinking about what you said regarding legacy and transmission of knowledge, and I have been wondering, would you ever consider documenting your methods, setting down in written form the principles that guide your work?" Thomas paused in the midst of arranging his pigment vials. The question had not occurred to him before, and he was not immediately certain how to respond. "What do you mean precisely?" he asked. "I mean," William said carefully, "that the knowledge you carry, the understanding of how to achieve mastery in this craft, the philosophy that underlies the technical skill, exists primarily in your hands and your mind. When you eventually set down your brush for the final time, that knowledge will not disappear entirely, because young Thomas and I will carry it forward. But there might be value in also setting it down in written form, for others who might come after, for future generations of scribes who might benefit from understanding not just the technique but the deeper principles." Young Thomas nodded in agreement, clearly having discussed this idea with William beforehand. It would be a form of teaching that could reach beyond those of us who sit in this scriptorium with you, young Thomas added. Scribes in other monasteries, craftsmen in other places, all those who devoted themselves to this work. Thomas found himself genuinely moved by the suggestion. He had never thought of himself as a writer or a teacher in the formal sense. He had always understood his teaching to happen through the silent transmission of knowledge, through observation, through proximity, through the younger craftsmen gradually absorbing the principles by watching them applied. And yet, there was something appealing about the idea of attempting to articulate, in written form, the understanding that had taken him 50 years to develop. It would be a different kind of work from Illumination, work that required using a different part of his mind, the part that dealt with language and abstraction rather than color and form. But perhaps that was exactly why it would be valuable. "I will consider it," Thomas said finally. "Give me time to think about whether such a work is even possible." Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself thinking about William's suggestion in odd moments, while he worked, while he walked in the cloister, while he sat in the church singing the familiar psalms. The more he considered it, the more he realized that the attempt to articulate his understanding might itself be a form of learning, a way of deepening his own comprehension of principles that he had lived out but never fully examined. In early August, he approached the abbot with a request. Would the monastery support a project in which Thomas attempted to document, in written form, the principles of illumination as he understood them? It would require setting aside some of his regular illumination work to focus on writing and instruction. The abbot, who was a thoughtful and learned man, considered the request seriously. This would be a valuable service to the wider community of monks, he said finally. Other monasteries would benefit from such knowledge, and it would be appropriate that your life's work be documented in this way. You have my blessing. And so, in the late summer of his 51st year, Thomas began a new phase of work. He would continue to illuminate manuscripts in the mornings and early afternoons, but he set aside the later afternoon hours for writing. Brother Cuthbert, who had some skill with the preparation of materials, assisted him in creating tablets of wax on which Thomas could write his initial thoughts. These wax tablets could be reused, the words could be erased, and new ones written, making them ideal for the kind of exploratory, revisional work that this new project required. His first attempts at writing were awkward. Thomas had spent his entire life in wordless communication, expressing himself through color and form and careful attention to detail. Writing in words seemed clumsy by comparison, inadequate to the nuance of what he was trying to convey. Young Thomas, who had some facility with writing from his years of education before becoming a scribe, offered to help. Together, they developed a process. Thomas would speak his thoughts aloud, and young Thomas would write them down. Then Thomas would revise, clarify, expand, until the written words came as close as possible to capturing the understanding Thomas possessed. The work proceeded slowly. It was frustrating at times. Thomas would spend an hour trying to articulate a principle that he understood intuitively, but found difficult to express in language. And yet there was also something satisfying about the process, something that felt like a deepening of his own understanding even as he attempted to transmit it to others. By September, Thomas had accumulated a substantial collection of wax tablets, filled with observations about the nature of the craft, how to prepare pigments, how to mix colors to achieve specific effects, how to understand the relationship between the artist and the work, how to develop mastery through patient repetition. But more importantly, he had begun to articulate the deeper principles. The understanding that illumination was ultimately a form of service, that the goal was not to draw attention to the artist, but to enhance the reader's encounter with the sacred text, that beauty was not an end in itself, but a means to drawing the mind and heart toward the divine. As autumn approached once again, William expressed a desire to return to his cathedral scriptorium, carrying with him what he had learned. The abbot agreed to release him, understanding that William's real gift to the monastery was not his continued presence, but his commitment to carry forward the principles he had learned. On William's final day at the monastery, Thomas gave him something precious, a small illuminated page that he had created specifically for the younger craftsman. It was not a formal manuscript page, but rather a kind of artistic gift, a single decorated initial letter, surrounded by intricate patterns and hidden creatures, done in Thomas's finest style. "This is for you to carry forward," Thomas said as he handed it to William. "Not as a record of what I can do, but as a reminder of what all craftsmen can do when they understand that their work is ultimately in service to something larger than themselves. Show it to others, tell them where it came from, and continue to practice your craft with the understanding that every careful detail, every patient stroke of the brush, is a form of prayer." William took the page with trembling hands, clearly moved by the gift. "I will," he said, "and I will make certain that my grandfather's teaching, the teaching you gave him and that you have reinforced in me, continues forward. When I train other scribes, I will pass on what you have taught me." After William departed, the scriptorium seemed quieter, though young Thomas remained. But the loss of William's presence seemed to mark a shift in the season itself. The autumn colors began to appear in the monastery's trees. The evenings grew cooler. The sense of summer's abundance gave way to a different quality of light, richer, more golden, suggesting both harvest and impending rest. Thomas continued his dual work, illuminating manuscripts in the mornings, and in the afternoons, working with young Thomas to refine and expand the written documentation of his understanding. The wax tablets accumulated, and eventually, Thomas commissioned young Thomas to copy the most important passages onto parchment, so that the knowledge would be preserved in a more permanent form than the fragile wax. In October, as the monastery prepared for the approach of winter, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. It was a young woman, traveling with a small group of monks from a distant abbey. She introduced herself as Margaret, and she explained that she had come seeking Brother Thomas because her father had once been a scribe in the monastery, and had returned to his native region carrying with him the principles of illumination that Thomas had taught him. "My father spent his life training other scribes in his cathedral," Margaret explained, "and he always spoke of this monastery, of a master illuminator named Thomas who had taught him that the work was a form of prayer. When I came of age, I asked to be trained in this craft as well, and my father, before he died, asked me to travel here if I could, to see with my own eyes the place where he had learned what mattered most about his work. Thomas felt tears form in his eyes, something that rarely happened to him. To learn that the teachings he had tried to embody through his work had been carried forward through multiple generations, had shaped other craftsmen, had rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated, seemed to confirm something fundamental about the nature of his life's work. He spent time with Margaret, showing her the scriptorium, explaining the processes he used, allowing her to observe him at work. And he gave her, as he had given William, a small illuminated page, her own unique creation, distinct from William's, reflecting her own particular presence and her own connection to her father's legacy. "Your father understood what matters most," Thomas told her as she prepared to depart. "He understood that the work is not ultimately about the artist's skill or the artist's reputation, but about service, service to the text, to the reader, to something sacred that transcends our individual lives. Continue to practice your craft with that understanding, and when you teach others, pass on not just the technical skill but this deeper understanding." As autumn deepened and the leaves fell from the trees, Thomas found himself in a state of profound peace. The work he had devoted his entire adult life to was continuing, not just in the manuscripts he created, but in the craftsmen and craftswomen he had trained, in the understanding he had managed to articulate in written form, in the knowledge that rippled outward through the monastery and beyond into the wider world of scribes and illuminators and monks devoted to creating beauty in service to the sacred. The manuscript documenting his teachings was nearing completion. Young Thomas worked carefully to copy the final passages onto fine parchment, preserving Thomas's words in a form that would outlast his own life, that might guide future generations of craftsmen long after both he and young Thomas had returned to dust. One afternoon in late November, as the first snow began to fall and the monastery prepared for its annual transition into winter, Thomas sat alone in the scriptorium for the first time in many months. The space was quiet, filled with the soft sound of falling snow against the high windows. His workspace awaited him, brushes hung to dry, pigments safely stored, ready for the next day's work. He thought about the arc of his life, 51 years now, with perhaps another 10 or 15 remaining if God granted him continued health. He had devoted all of it to this work, to bringing color and light to sacred texts, to understanding that his labor was part of a vast continuity stretching backward through centuries and forward into centuries, yet unborn. He had not become famous. His name would likely be forgotten within a generation or two, but the work itself would endure. The illuminated letters would continue to guide readers. The teachings he had articulated would be carried forward by those he had trained. And the understanding that craft, when approached with devotion and service, becomes sacred, that understanding would ripple outward in ways he could never fully comprehend or measure. This was enough. This was everything. This was the quiet victory of a life fully lived, work fully devoted, a heart fully engaged with the task set before him. The snow continued to fall. The monastery settled into the silence of approaching winter. And Thomas, his work for the day complete, his legacy assured, made his way toward the church for the evening prayers, his soul at peace, his heart full of gratitude for the life that had been given to him and the work that had filled every day of it with meaning. The bells for Compline rang out across the monastery as Thomas made his way through the cloister toward the church. The first snow of winter lay soft upon the stone, muffling his footsteps, creating a silence that seemed almost sacred in its completeness. In the church, the community gathered for the final prayer service of the day. The candles had been lit, casting their warm glow across the vaulted stone ceiling. Thomas took his place in the choir, and as he had done thousands of times before, he added his voice to the ancient harmonies that had sustained this monastery for more than 100 years. The psalm they sang spoke of rest, of completion, of trust in a wisdom larger than any individual understanding. The words had taken on new meaning as Thomas had aged, as he had watched monks come and go, as he had witnessed the work continue uninterrupted through all the seasons of his long devotion. To sing them now was to acknowledge both the smallness of his own life and its profound participation in something vast and eternal. When the service ended, Thomas did not immediately return to his cell. Instead, he found himself drawn toward the library, that quiet space filled with the accumulated work of generations of scribes. He moved slowly along the familiar shelves, his fingers trailing lightly across the leather bindings. Some of these volumes he had illuminated himself. Others bore the marks of scribes long dead, craftsmen whose names he would never know but whose hands had created beauty that endured across centuries. He withdrew one of the oldest manuscripts, an antiphonal from perhaps 200 years prior. The colors had faded somewhat with age, but they still held their essential beauty. The gold leaf still gleamed. The small creatures hidden in the margins still waited patiently for patient readers to discover them. Running his fingers lightly across the illuminated letters, Thomas felt a profound sense of continuity. This unknown scribe, dead for 2 centuries, had understood exactly what Thomas understood, that the work was not about the individual artist, but about service to something larger. And now, more than 200 years later, the work spoke still. It still is. It still guided readers. His own work would do the same. Long after his hands had grown too stiff to hold a brush, long after his eyes had closed for the final time, the letters he had illuminated would continue to glow on their pages. Other monks would carry them from the library when they were needed for services. Readers would encounter them and be moved by their beauty. The small creatures would wait in the margins, faithful witnesses to a craftsman's care. He returned the antiphonal carefully to its shelf and withdrew the most recent volume to which he had contributed, a psalter completed just that summer. The gold leaf highlights caught the candlelight and seemed to generate their own radiance. The colors sang together in their careful harmony. The hidden creatures peeked out from the margins with their quiet intelligence. This was his work. This was his prayer. This was the way his hands had spoken truth across his entire adult life. Thomas closed the manuscript gently and held it to his chest for a moment, acknowledging the profound privilege of having spent his life in the creation of such beauty. Then he returned it to its shelf, where it would wait for future generations to discover it, to use it, to find in it the guidance toward the sacred that had motivated every careful stroke of his brush. Making his way slowly back through the cloister, Thomas paused beneath the apple tree. The snow lay thick on its bare branches, transforming it into something almost crystalline in the starlight. In spring, it will bloom again. In summer, it would bear fruit. The cycle would continue as it had continued for all the years of Thomas's life, as it would continue long after he was gone. In his small cell, Thomas lit a single candle and prepared himself for sleep with the ritual that had structured all his nights. The window above his bed showed the deep blue-black of night touched by stars. The snow had stopped falling. The monastery was utterly silent, wrapped in the profound peace of winter's approach. He lay beneath his wool blanket, aware of the candle burning down slowly, casting gentle shadows across the stone walls. His hands, those faithful ink-stained hands that had served him so well, were folded peacefully at his sides. His mind drifted through the day, the morning's illumination work, the afternoon's instruction of young Thomas, the completion of another page of manuscript documenting his teachings. He thought of William, now carrying forward the knowledge in a distant cathedral. He thought of Margaret, continuing her father's legacy. He thought of Edmund and Matthew, now at rest, their work completed, their contributions to the monastery's mission secured in the manuscripts that bore the evidence of their careful labor. And he thought of young Thomas, the younger scribe who would eventually take his place, who would continue to illuminate manuscripts long after Thomas himself had set down his brush for the final time. The work would continue. The light would not go out. Future generations would understand, as Thomas understood, that the true purpose of their labor was not recognition, but service. Service to the sacred text. Service to the readers who would encounter these illuminated pages. Service to something larger and more enduring than any individual human life. The candle burned lower. The shadows in Thomas's cell deepened. But there was no darkness here, only a gentle dimming, the natural rhythm of evening transitioning into night, of one day giving way to the next, of the vast cycle of seasons and years that held all human effort within its vast, patient embrace. Thomas's breathing slowed. His mind grew quieter. The boundaries between his individual consciousness and the greater consciousness that held the monastery, the cloister, the entire cosmos in its gentle embrace, seemed to soften and dissolve. He slipped into sleep as peacefully as he had slipped into sleep thousands of nights before, his body at rest, his heart at peace, his soul knowing with absolute certainty that the work would continue, that the light he had spent his life creating would endure, that in giving himself completely to the service of beauty and truth, he had participated in something eternal. The candle burned down to nothing. The monastery settled into the deep silence of night, and Thomas rested, his work complete for this day, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new letters to illuminate, new opportunities to serve through his craft, new chances to draw beauty from the sacred marriage of intention and attention, color and care, human hands and divine grace. The winter night deepened around the monastery. Stars wheeled slowly across the black sky. Snow lay silent and pure across the cloister. The herb garden, the courtyard, and the earth itself seemed to rest, waiting patiently for spring, for renewal, for the eternal return of light and warmth and growth. In his narrow bed, Thomas slept the sleep of the just, the sleep that comes only to those who have given themselves completely to work they love, to a mission larger than themselves, to the understanding that a single human life, devoted with complete attention and care to a sacred purpose, is enough, is everything, is a small but genuine participation in the eternal work of creation itself. The bells would ring again in the morning. The community would gather for matins. Thomas would rise and make his way to the church, and then to the scriptorium, where his brush awaited, where his colors waited, where the eternal work of bringing light to sacred words would continue, sustained by his hands and the hands of those who came after, a chain of devotion stretching backward through centuries and forward into a future he would never see, but in which his work would endure. But for now there was only rest, only peace, only the deep contentment of a life well lived, work well done, and the infinite gratitude of a human heart that understood finally and completely that in losing himself in his work, he had found everything that mattered. The monastery held him gently in the darkness. This man who had spent 50 years teaching the world that beauty, when created in service to something sacred, becomes immortal. His hands would age. His eyes would grow dim. His breath would eventually cease. But the illuminated letters would remain. The hidden creatures would wait in the margins. The gold leaf would catch the light for centuries yet unborn. And somewhere in the vast continuity of human effort and divine grace, Thomas's devotion would continue to speak, to teach, to guide, to illuminate, forever.